The blacksmith was heating the stubborn plowshare for the third time, and the metal was crumbling under the hammer. Without a plow, the village would have no harvest. And then a skinny guy, whom everyone considered a dimwit, reached his hands right into the red-hot forge. He scooped out the damp wood. He stood at the bellows, and 10 minutes later, the iron began to obey, as if someone had broken the spell. Now let's rewind 3 days. The cold wakes him before he's fully conscious. His cheek rests on something wet and woolly. It reeks of smoke and goat. Daniel Kane opens his eyes and sees a dirt ceiling speckled with soot. The body is not his own. Light, slender at the wrists. The fingers are narrow and calloused in a way he doesn't remember. He sits up with a jolt, and his head explodes with pain from temple to temple. And then it unfolds before his eyes. A map. Transparent like a technical overlay in augmented reality. It hangs over the wall, over the door, over the whole world. He sees the mountainside as if the skin had been stripped from the mountain. A red layer at a depth of 12 meters. Magnetite. High iron content. Estimated volume, 180,000 tons. The numbers pop up on their own, and he reads them as easily as a geological survey report. Dan stands up. His legs are unsteady. He pushes the door open, and behind it rise the mountains. Gray, bony. And the entire range, stretching from horizon to horizon, glows for him in colored layers. Red iron, black coal, white salt, warm gold. And at the very depths of the ridge, at the limit of visibility, blue sparks flicker. The map displays a single line. Unknown material, high magical concentration, depth 1,400 meters. Dan looks at his own unfamiliar hands and laughs quietly. He tells the mountains, "Well then, let's get to work." For 2 days, he pieces himself back together, bit by bit. The body belongs to a 22-year-old coal miner's son. His father died 2 years ago, his mother before that. The whole village considers the young man a quiet simpleton who barely scrapes by on firewood. The village is called Greystone and clings to the slope of the Bone-Tooth Ridge. 40 people, 1 smithy, not a single shop. The nearest town is a 4-day journey away. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan walks through the village and the map works non-stop. Every stone is an open book. Iron ore 12 meters down, coal at 40 meters, clay for crucibles right on the surface, a stream for washing, wood for supports. Everything needed for real metallurgy lies at these people's feet, and they walk right over this wealth without knowing it. On the 3rd day, Dan freezes in his tracks by the smithy. And here you already know what's happening. Blacksmith Oswald is swinging his hammer and cursing. The chisel is crumbling. The village headman sent his last plow to be reforged a week ago, and without it, the spring planting is in jeopardy. Dan stares at the flames and sees the problem as clearly as the ore veins beneath the ground. Only this isn't magic. It's 8 years in mine shafts and on industrial sites. The memory of his hands. He steps closer, asks what kind of coal Oswald is burning, sniffs the smoke, looks at the stack. Under the coal are damp logs, because behind them there's a cold zone at the bottom of the furnace, and the metal is heating unevenly. And Oswald is pumping the bellows in jerks. The temperature is fluctuating. Dan doesn't wait for permission. He reaches into the furnace with his hands. He scoops out the damp wood. He spreads the coal in an even layer. He stands by the bellows and pumps. Slowly, steadily, without jerks. The furnace hums evenly, and the anvil turns red, then yellow. It glows yellow-white along its entire length. Oswald strikes with the hammer, and the iron yields softly to the blow. Another blow. Another. The metal obeys. The blacksmith is silent for 10 minutes. Then he looks at the skinny kid whom the whole village had written off as a good-for-nothing. He asks how he knows this. Dan shrugs. He says he watched. By evening, the village is already buzzing. Old Cain's son is figuring something out in the fire. The next morning, Oswald comes to the shack himself. He hesitates at the door. He offers a job in exchange for a bowl of porridge and a piece of bacon. Dan agrees. But he asks for something in return. Not food. Permission to dig on the northern slope, where the land is considered wasteland. Oswald asks why. Dan replies that he wants to test an idea. Village Elder Holt doesn't like change. In his experience, change means one thing: the valley's attention. And that has brought mountain villages nothing but trouble. But no one needs the northern slope anyway. Let him dig. But if he brings trouble, he'll answer for it himself. The next morning, Dan heads out to the slope, and the map is working perfectly. The magnetite vein starts 12 meters down and runs deep at a 32-degree angle. Iron content is over 60%. Below that is a coal seam. Water flows to the left, so the tunnel won't flood. The roof is solid. It won't collapse if we set up supports. 8 meters of drilling through shale. 2 weeks for 2 men. We need people. That evening in the smithy, Dan speaks plainly. There's iron ore under the northern slope. Rich ore. We'll get it and smelt it. Greystone will have its own iron instead of imported stuff at double the price. Oswald asks how he knows. Dan replies that he saw outcrops and identified the vein by its color. Half-truth. He did see the signs, but without a map, he wouldn't be sure. Oswald thinks. 2 weeks before winter is a long time if the guy is wrong. Dan nods. He's willing to work for free. If there's no ore, he'll work hard to earn back every bowl of porridge. The blacksmith extends his hand. They shake hands. Now they need people. First up is Ty, a young hunter who didn't bag any game this year. His mother is sick. His sister is young. Dan speaks plainly. I'm digging a tunnel. I need a man who isn't afraid of hard work. I'll pay you in silver when I sell the first ore. Ty looks at him like he's crazy. What silver in Greystone? Dan replies that there's ore under the slope. If it's not there in 2 weeks, you'll have wasted your time. But your family will get money for the first time in a year. Ty thinks for a minute. He'll come tomorrow. Second, Gregor, a former miner in his 50s. 15 years ago, a cave-in broke his back. Now he can't stand up straight for more than an hour. He drinks whenever he can get his hands on booze. Dan sits down next to him and starts talking, not about the ore, about the supports. He says he needs a man who knows how to set up supports in this kind of rock. Gregor turns his head, and for the first time, something other than emptiness appears in his eyes. He asks what kind of rock it is. Dan describes shale with layers of granite, the dip angle, the roof pressure. Gregor's back straightens imperceptibly. He says they need post and beam support with oak crossbeams, posts every 1.5 meters. Dan nods. Gregor says he can't swing a pickaxe. Dan replies that he doesn't need a pickaxe, but a brain. Let him sit at the entrance and tell them where to set the supports. Gregor stares for a long time. Then he quietly says he'll come. The third Finn, a 15-year-old orphan living with the village headman, skinny as a rake, with the wary look of a man who could be chased away at any moment. He comes up the slope on his own and stands to the side. Dan hands him a shovel. The boy digs until dark without complaining. In the evening, Dan gives him his portion of porridge. The Finn eats it in silence and comes back the next morning. This is how the work begins. 4 men with pickaxes, shovels, and a single wheelbarrow against the mountain. Dan marks the direction on the map, but in a way that makes it look like he's reading the rock. He touches the stone. He taps it. He sniffs it. Gregor sits at the entrance on an overturned bucket. Move the stand to the left. The overburden is denser. The rock is pressing down here. Tai chops furiously and silently with his pickaxe. Finn hauls out the rock. On the 5th day, Tai stops. They've gone 4 meters, but there's no ore. Dan replies that the ore is 12 meters down and the tunnel runs at an angle. Tai looks at the gray shale. He asks, "What if there isn't any there?" Dan picks up a piece of rock from the floor. He shows him thin reddish veins. These are iron oxides, signs of a nearby vein. The rock changes color when the ore is nearby, and Tai sees this with his own eyes. On the 9th day, Tai's pickaxe strikes something different. The dull thud against the shale gives way to a solid metallic ring. Tai steps back. Dan clears the face with his hands. A dark, shiny stone emerges from the gray rock. Magnetite. Dan chips off a piece and holds it up to the light. Heavy, dense, with a metallic sheen on the chip. Gregor lifts himself off the bucket, takes the ore, turns it in his hands, whistles softly, says they get 3 silver coins per cartload of this stuff down in the valley. Tai looks at the black stone. He shifts his gaze to Dan, and for the first time in 9 days, he smiles. On the morning of the 10th day, Dan stood at the entrance to the tunnel and counted. According to the map, the magnetite vein stretched more than 200 meters into the mountain. The thickness of the seam ranged from 0.5 meter to 2. That was tens of thousands of tons of good ore, enough to keep him working for years. But right now, he had nothing but 4 pairs of hands and a wheelbarrow. He had to think differently. Not about how to extract all the ore, but about how to extract the first ton and sell it. He went back into the tunnel and spent the whole day digging. Tai and Finn worked with pickaxes. Gregor kept an eye on the support and showed them where to strike so the pieces would break off larger. Dan sorted. Pure magna into one pile, low-grade rock into another, waste rock into a third for the dump. By evening, a pile of black rock the size of a good wheelbarrow lay at the tunnel entrance. Dan picked up a chunk and estimated its weight. About a ton, maybe a little more. He told Tay that tomorrow they would go down to the village and talk to Oswald. The blacksmith had to see the ore with his own eyes. Oswald came on his own. Apparently, Finn had let it slip over dinner at the village headman's house. In the morning, the blacksmith stood by the tunnel and silently looked at the pile of ore. He picked up a piece. He turned it over. He licked the cut edge. An old blacksmith's way of determining iron by taste. Then he looked at Dan and said just one word. Good. Dan nodded and got down to business. He explained the plan to Oswald. Selling raw ore isn't profitable. 3 silver coins per cartload is peanuts. But if you set up a simple washing plant on the bank of the stream and remove the main waste rock from the ore, the pure concentrate will fetch 10 silver pieces. And if you smelt the concentrate into cast iron ingots, the price will rise to 40. And if you forge decent steel from the cast iron, a single cartload of steel billets is worth more than gold down in the valley. Oswald listened, and his face changed. He was a simple village blacksmith. He had never thought of ore as a chain of processes, each of which multiplies the price. He thought of metal as a material that was either good or bad. Dan saw this and spoke slowly, without complicated words, using examples that Oswald could understand. Ore is like grain. You can sell the grain. You can grind it into flour and sell it for more. You can bake bread and sell it for even more. They're sitting on a mountain of grain right now and selling it by the handful. We need to set up a mill. Oswald asked what kind of mill. Dan replied that to start with, we need a washing plant and a small smelter. He'll build the washing plant himself out of wood and leather. For the smelter, we need a bigger furnace and good charcoal. Lots of charcoal. Oswald said there was no charcoal, The upper plot is almost cleared. Dan smiled and said, "We don't need to burn wood for charcoal. There's coal under the slope." He'd seen the outcrops. "But that's for later. For now, we'll start with what we have." For the next 2 weeks, Dan was torn between the adit and the stream bank. At the stream, he built a sluice box. The design was simple: a long, sloped trough made of split logs. Inside, crosswise slats, riffles. Crushed ore is poured on top, and water from the stream washes away the light, barren rock, while the heavy magnetite settles behind the slats. The oldest principle of ore processing. Dan had known it since his freshman year of college. No one here knew it. Finn helped build the chute and asked questions. Why were the slats at that angle? Why was the distance between them different? Why were the top ones wide and the bottom ones narrow? Dan answered every question, not because the guy could understand the hydrodynamics of the enrichment process, but because, for the first time in his life, Finn was asking questions and getting answers. That was more important than any ore. Ty continued working in the adit. He was picking things up quickly. He learned to read the rock by the sound of the blow and the color of the dust. Dan showed him how to determine where the vein widened and where it narrowed, how to strike the cracks to chip off large chunks rather than pulverizing the ore into sand. Ty picked it up on the first try. A hunter's hands, accustomed to precise movements, fit the tool well. Gregor sat at the entrance. His back wouldn't let him work inside for more than an hour, but he knew the support system like no one else. Every morning he walked through the tunnel and checked the struts. He tapped on them. He listened. If a strut hummed hollowly, it meant the pressure and a prop needed to be set. If it rang out, everything was fine. Dan watched him and learned. The theory in his head was from the 21st century. The practice was here. And Gregor knew the practice better than any textbook. By the end of the second week after the vein was discovered, they had about 3 tons of enriched concentrate. Dark, heavy sand with an iron content of over 70%. Oswald tried smelting the first batch in his forge. The result was poor. The forge was too small, the temperature was insufficient. What came out was a spongy mass with a pile of slag. Dan had expected this. He told Oswald that a forge for smithing and a forge for smelting were 2 different things. They needed a furnace, a small one, but a real one. He sat by the fire that evening and sketched a diagram on a flat stone. The simplest shaft furnace. A tower of stone and fire clay 2 men tall. At the bottom, a blast hole. On the side, an opening for slag discharge. Air is supplied by bellows through a clay pipe. Coal and ore are loaded in layers from the top. The principle is as old as civilization itself, but here in Greystone, no one built such furnaces. Here they bought imported iron for a fortune or reworked scrap metal. Oswald looked at the drawing and stroked his chin. He asked where to get that much clay. Dan pointed to the bank of the stream. "There's clay there. Good stuff. Fireproof." He checked it out. Oswald asked about stone. Dan pointed to the pile of waste rock by the tunnel. Slate and granite. The stuff they'd been throwing away could be used for masonry. Oswald asked about the bellows. His bellows were small. For a forge. For a furnace, they needed large ones. Dan said he'd make them. He needed 2 ox hides and a wooden frame. He'd make them himself. Oswald fell silent. Then he said there were no ox hides in the village. The last ox had been slaughtered last year. Dan thought for a moment. This was the first real dead end. Without bellows, there's no draft. Without draft, there's no temperature. Without temperature, there's no smelting. We could use goatskins. They're smaller. So the bellows will be smaller. So the draft will be weaker. So the furnace needs to be made shorter and narrower. He did the math. A furnace 1.5 meters high instead of 2. The smelting capacity is smaller. The metal yield per load is about 15 kilograms instead of 40, but that was still better than nothing. Dan recalculated again and nodded to himself. He told Oswald that the goatskins would be enough. Let's build it. They built the furnace for 10 days. Dan and Finn dug up clay on the bank of the stream. They mixed it with sand and straw. They shaped the bricks and dried them in the wind. Oswald laid the walls. His hands knew stone and mortar no worse than a hammer and anvil. Ty hauled rock from the pile for the foundation. Gregor sat nearby and cursed the crooked rows. He was a perfectionist when it came to construction. Every stone had to lie. Every joint had to be even. Otherwise, it would crack at the very first heating. Dan listened to him and corrected the masonry. 2 old masters in one body. An engineer from the future and a miner from the past. Finn wandered between them with buckets of clay and wide-open eyes. On the 8th day of construction, the village elder Holt came to the site. He stood silently and looked at the furnace rising from the ground like a stone mushroom. Then he approached Dan and asked what it was. Dan replied that it was a smelting furnace.
For iron?
Holt asked. So there's ore on the slope? Dan said there was. A lot. Holt was silent for a long time. Then he asked quietly, "The valley will find out." Dan replied that sooner or later, yes. Holt looked him in the eyes. The elder's gaze was heavy. It held 30 years of life on the mountainside. 30 years of watching how the valley treated the mountain villages. Taxes, confiscations, conscription drives. When the valley needed grain, it took the grain. When it needed people, it took the people. And the mountain villages endured because they were small and poor and of no use to anyone. But a village that has its own iron is no longer a poor village. It is a target. Holt said all this with a single glance. Dan understood. He replied that he knew. So the first steel won't be sold to the valley. The first steel will be used to make tools for the village. Nails, hinges, knives, spearheads. Everything Greystone needs to survive the winter. And they'll start trading in the spring, quietly, through passing merchants, little by little, without drawing attention. Holt listened. His face remained impassive. Then he nodded, turned, and left. The next day he sent 2 strong men to help with the masonry for the upper part of the furnace. No explanations, no conditions. He just sent them. Dan realized that this was his way of giving consent. The 10th day. The furnace was ready. Not very tall. A 5-foot-tall stone-clay tower widening toward the bottom. 2 openings for the tuyères. Goat bladders on wooden frames. The slag outlet plugged with a clay stopper. Dan stood nearby and checked everything one last time. The joints between the bricks, the angle of the tuyères, the height of the charging opening. He was an engineer, and an engineer checks twice, then 3 times, then once more. They loaded the first charge, a layer of charcoal at the bottom, a layer of enriched concentrate, charcoal again, ore again. Oswald lit the charcoal from below through the tuyère opening. Dan stood at the bellows. He had to pump steadily, without breaks, for a long time. He pumped and counted in his head. The temperature in the furnace had to rise above 1,200 degrees. With this draft and this volume, it would take about 3 hours, maybe 4. The goatskin bellows provided less air than he had calculated.
An hour later, Ty relieved him.
2 hours later, Finn took over for Ty. It was hard work for the guy. The bellows were stiff, but he didn't stop. He gritted his teeth and kept pumping. 3 hours later, white smoke began to rise from the furnace. Then the smoke turned yellowish. Then a bright orange glow began to seep from the tuyere opening. Dan walked over and peered inside through the top opening. The charge had settled. The ore was melting. The first thin stream of slag flowed out through the lower outlet, a dark, glassy mass. Dan knocked out the clay plug, and the slag flowed into a trench dug in advance. 4 hours later, he gave the order to stop. The furnace cooled slowly. They waited until evening. Then they dismantled the front wall and retrieved it. The bloom. A lump of spongy iron the size of 2 fists. Porous, heavy, hot. Dan placed the bloom on a stone. It was gray with a metallic sheen on the chips. Not cast iron, not steel. Raw pig iron with a high slag content. It needed to be forged to drive out the slag and compact the metal. Oswald picked up the pig iron with tongs and carried it to the smithy. He placed it in the forge. He heated it up.
He pulled it out onto the anvil and began to strike it. With a heavy hammer, with even blows. Slag flew off in sparks. The metal compacted with every blow. It grew lighter, cleaner, denser. After half an hour of hammering, a strip of iron an elbow's length long and 2 fingers thick lay on the anvil. Oswald stopped. He set down the hammer. He picked up the strip and bent it. The iron bent smoothly without cracking. He straightened it back out. Not a single break. The blacksmith turned to Dan. His eyes were shining. He said quietly that this was the best iron he'd held in his hands in 20 years of work. Dan nodded. He knew it would be so. Magnetite with a low impurity content yields pure iron, and pure iron in the hands of a good blacksmith yields good steel. It was the first strip of in the history of Greystone. By morning, the news had spread throughout the village. People came to the smithy and looked at the bar of iron. They touched it. Some didn't believe it. Others believed it, but didn't understand what it meant. And it meant that Greystone was no longer dependent on imported iron, no longer dependent on the prices dictated by the valley merchants. It was no longer at the mercy of passing caravans. The village now had its own ore, its own furnace, its own iron. A week later, Oswald forged the first batch of nails from the new iron, 40 of them, straight, strong, and identical. Before, nails in Greystone were few and far between. Every one accounted for. When an old house was torn down, the nails were carefully pulled out and stored as a treasure. Now Oswald placed 40 new nails on the counter and said this was just the beginning. The next day he made 6 knives, then a dozen horseshoes, then an axe for Ty. A good axe with the right tempering. Ty held it in his hands and said nothing. Then he said he wanted to work in the tunnel full time, not for room and board, for a share. Dan smiled and said that was exactly what he'd wanted to offer. The first month passed. The tunnel had been dug 12 meters deeper. Life was getting better. The furnace ran every other day. Dan optimized the process. He increased the charging height. He added a second row of tuyères to preheat the blast air. Metal output rose from 15 to 25 kilograms per melt. He still wasn't getting enough sleep. He'd get up before dawn. He'd go to the tunnel, then to the washing area, then to the furnace, then to Oswald's smithy. Then he'd sit by the fire and sketch out plans on stones for what needed to be done tomorrow. The list grew faster than he could cross things off. But the village was starting to change. You could tell by the little things. A new door on iron hinges had appeared on Tay's house. The roof of Gregor's shed had been patched up. Finn was wearing new boots. Small ones, but real ones. bought with the lad's share from the first sale. A peddler passed through the village. A small-time peddler with a donkey and 2 bundles. He bought hides and sold salt and cloth. Dan went out to meet him and offered to sell him ore. The peddler looked skeptical. Then he saw the concentrate. He touched it. He weighed it in his hand. His eyes widened. He asked where it came from. Dan said from the local hillside. The peddler offered 2 silver coins for a cartload. Dan shook his head and named 8. The merchant laughed. Dan shrugged and started to turn away. The merchant stopped him. They haggled for 10 minutes. They settled on 6. The merchant took the cart of concentrate and walked off down the road. 6 silver coins lay in Dan's palm, heavy and real. Winter came early. At the beginning of the 2nd month, the first serious snowfall hit Greystone. It piled up knee-deep overnight. The temperature dropped, and the stream by the sluice began to freeze over in the mornings. Dan stood at the entrance to the tunnel, breathing out steam. The map showed the usual strata, but right now he wasn't thinking about ore. He was thinking about winter. Over 40 people in a mountain village with no proper supplies. The hunting was poor. There was enough grain to last 2 months if they rationed it. There would be enough firewood if there weren't any truly bitter frosts. There was almost no salted meat. Salt was imported and expensive. The last merchant had passed through 2 weeks ago, and there might not be another one until spring. Dan made a list in his head. He knew how to calculate resources. 8 years on industrial sites had taught him to view logistics as a system. Input, output, stock, consumption, critical points, failure point. Greystone was on the verge of failure. Not now, in 2 months. If nothing changed, by midwinter they would start starving. Not everyone, but the weakest, the elderly, the children, those with no reserves. He went down to see Holt. The village elder was sitting by the hearth, sharpening a knife. Dan sat across from him and spoke bluntly. He asked how much grain was in the communal storeroom. Holt looked at him suspiciously. Dan explained that he wasn't planning to dip into other people's grain. He needed to know the numbers to figure out what to do. Holt paused. Then he named them. 8 sacks of wheat, 3 sacks of barley, a sack of peas, a barrel of pickled turnips. Dan did the math. 45 people, 4 months of winter. It wouldn't be enough. Not nearly enough. Holt knew that without doing the math. He said it was like that every winter. Every winter, someone didn't make it to spring. The strongest survive. It's always been that way. Dan said nothing. Then he asked when the tax collector from Velmar would arrive. Holt replied that it was usually at the start of winter, in a week, maybe 2. Dan asked how much he takes. Holt said, 1/4 of the grain, 1/10 of the meat, if there's any meat, and a silver coin from every household. Dan did the math. 1/4 of 8 sacks is 2 sacks of wheat. A silver coin from every household is 14 coins. The village doesn't have 14 silver coins. The village has 4 silver coins in Holt's treasury from the share of the ore sale. If they don't pay, the collector will file a report. A squad will arrive in a month. If they don't pay the squad, they'll take it themselves. Dan understood this dynamic. It was the same in any world. The small pay the big, or the small get crushed. He told Holt that he had a plan, but it would take time, and Holt would have to trust him. The village head looked at him with the same heavy gaze he'd had by the stove. Then he said, "Speak." Dan started with food. Salt. If the village had its own salt, they could salt and preserve the meat from the hunt. Every deer or boar they shot would turn from 2 days' worth of food into a month's supply. Holt asked where they would get the salt. In the valley, a sack of salt costs 3 silver coins. Dan said there's a salt deposit beneath the eastern slope. Not deep, about 5 meters. If we dig a well and fill it with water, the salt will dissolve, and we can pump out the brine. The brine is evaporated in flat pans over a fire. The result is pure salt. White. Good. Cheaper than dirt because the only resources are labor and firewood. Holt looked at him. He asked how he knew there was salt there. Dan answered with the same half-truth. He'd seen the rock outcrops, whitish spots on the stones. The water from the spring lower down the slope tastes salty. Everything points to a salt horizon. Holt wasn't a geologist. He was the head man of a mining village. But he knew that the spring on the eastern slope was indeed brackish. Everyone knew. No one thought of it as anything useful. Dan continued. Second, taxes. If the tax collector arrives and sees the iron in the furnace, he'll write in his report that Greystone is conducting unregistered mining on Crown lands. That means more than just higher taxes. It means a fine, confiscation, maybe arrest. So when the collector arrives, he needs to see a typical, poverty-stricken mountain village. The furnace can be covered with brushwood and snow. The tunnel can be blocked with waste rock. The ore can be hidden in the woods under a canopy. The collector will stay a day or two. He won't climb up the slope into the snow. He'll take his share of grain and silver and leave. And they'll keep working. Holt listened in silence. Then he asked, "What if he finds out?" Dan replied that he wouldn't find out if everyone kept quiet. 45 people. All our own. No one from the village goes down to the valley in winter. There won't be any traders until spring. No one will give away a secret if no one asks about it. Holt thought for a long time. Then he nodded, but he set a condition. He would speak to every household himself. He would explain personally that they must keep quiet and why. Because if Dan did it, people would think young Cain was acting like the boss. But if Holt said it, people would listen. Dan agreed without hesitation. He understood. The village elder's authority was a tool. There was no point in breaking what worked. It had to be used. It took 3 days to set up the cover-up. They piled brushwood into the furnace and covered it with snow. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary pile of firewood. They blocked the entrance to the tunnel with rock and covered it with a log. It looked like an abandoned attempt to dig a cellar. They moved the ore into the woods under a shelter made of fir branches. They dismantled the sluice box and hid the parts. Gregor suggested leaving an empty wheelbarrow on its side by the tunnel to make it look more plausible. Dan approved. The old miner knew a thing or two about making a workplace look like it wasn't in use. At the same time, Dan began digging a salt well on the eastern slope. Ty and Finn helped. The work was hard. The ground was frozen solid for half a meter. Below that came clay, then soft limestone. The map showed a salt deposit at a depth of 5.5 meters. They dug for 2 days and reached 4 meters when the walls of the well began to ooze. The water was murky and bitterly salty. Dan tasted it and spat it out. Brine. Concentrated. It was even better than he'd expected. There was no need to dig all the way down to the layer. The groundwater at this depth was already saturated with salt. He made a simple bucket and pole system and began hauling up the brine. That evening, they evaporated the first batch, the brine in a flat clay pan over coals. Slowly. About 6 hours. The water evaporated, leaving white crystals at the bottom. Salt. Pure, white, fine-grained. Dan gathered it into a rag and carried it to Holt. He placed it on the table in front of the village elder. Holt touched the salt with his finger. He tasted it. His eyes widened slightly. It was good salt. Not the gray, dirty valley salt mixed with sand. White. Pure. Holt said nothing, But by evening, all of Greystone knew they now had their own salt. The women came first. Tay's mother, Holt's wife, old Egra, who lived alone on the edge of the village. They stood by Dan's house and waited. He came out, and they asked about the salt, how much they could take, when there would be more. Dan said there would be plenty of salt. The well produced brine every day. All they had to do was evaporate it. He would show them how. Anyone could come and collect brine to evaporate at home. The salt was free, for the whole village. It was a turning point. Not ore, not iron. Salt. Because ore and iron were abstract concepts to most people. But salt was something everyone understood. Salt meant curing meat for the winter. Salt meant sauerkraut. Salt meant preserved fish from the stream. Salt is survival. And so the guy whom everyone considered a quiet dimwit gave the village salt, for free, from the ground beneath their feet. The tax collector arrived 8 days later. His name was Clément, a thin man of about 35 on a gray horse, accompanied by 2 soldiers. He came to Greystone every year, and every year it was the same ritual. Clément would enter the village elder's house, unroll a scroll, read out the tax amount. Holt shook his head and said the village was poor. Clément shook his head and said the law was the law. Then they haggled over every sack. This year, Holt played his part flawlessly. The village looked wretched and pitiful. The houses were gray, the people were thin, snow all around. Clément read out the tax. 2 sacks of wheat and 14 silver. Holt spread his hands and said, there was no silver, none at all. The hunt was bad, the traders hadn't come. Clément grimaced. He knew Greystone was a worthless hole. Same thing every year. He agreed to 1.5 sacks of wheat and 8 silver coins. Holt counted out the coins slowly, as if each one caused him physical pain. That was part of the ritual too. Clément took the payment. His soldiers loaded the sack onto the horse. The collector looked at the village one last time. Empty yards, snowdrifts, smoke from the chimneys. Nothing of interest. He turned and rode down the road into the valley. When his figure disappeared around the bend, Dan thought some. He stood behind Oswald's house and watched through a gap in the fence. Everything had gone smoothly. The collector hadn't climbed the slope. He hadn't shown any interest in the north side. He hadn't even asked about the new well to the east. To him, Greystone remained what it had always been, a poor mountain village not worth a second glance. In the evening, the village came alive. They dug the stove out from under the snow and brushwood. The tunnel was cleared in an hour. The sluice was assembled by the next morning. Work continued, but now at double the speed. Because now there were 7 men working in the tunnel instead of 4. 3 new volunteers. A young guy named Bren, who had previously been scraping by chopping firewood. 2 brothers, Mark and Will, who hunted together and decided that the mine was safer than the woods in winter. Dan accepted all 3. He explained the rules. Shift work. 4 hours in the tunnel, 2 hours rest, then 4 hours again. Everyone wears a helmet. The helmets were made of wood, thick birch shells bound with a leather strap. It looked ridiculous, but Dan insisted. He had seen people die from falling rocks. Not in this world. In the past. And he wasn't going to let that happen here. Gregor agreed. He said they wore helmets in the valley mines too. Only leather ones. Dan nodded and said the leather ones would come later. For now, birch. Rule number 2. No one enters the tunnel alone. At least 2 people. Always. Rule 3. If you hear a crack in the roof, drop everything and get out. Don't look back. Don't gather your tools. Get out. Bren asked why there were so many rules. Dan looked at him and replied that it was because a dead miner doesn't extract ore. Bren fell silent. Gregor gave an approving chuckle. Winter was setting in. The furnace ran every other day. Oswald hammered away without stopping. Nails, horseshoes, arrowheads, hinges, staples, hooks. The village's small metal needs were being met for the first time in years. People were getting used to the fact that iron was no longer in short supply, that you could take a nail instead of begging for one, that a broken knife would be replaced with a new one in 2 days, not 6 months. The salt well yielded brine consistently. The village women set up an evaporation process. 3 pans worked around the clock in shifts. The salt was used for curing. Ty and the brothers Mark and Will took turns hunting between shifts in the tunnel. Every deer they shot was now salted and stored. Supplies were growing. Slowly, but surely, they grew. Dan slept 4 hours a day and kept going on sheer stubbornness. Every evening he sat by the fire and sketched on stones plans to expand the tunnel, a diagram of a second, larger furnace, a survey of the coal mine on the western slope, a design for a salt works with a covered canopy and drainage. All of this lay ahead. All of this was for the spring. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered: to survive until spring. Everyone, without losses. Every evening he counted the supplies: grain, meat, salt, firewood. Every morning he checked on the sick. Old Egmar was coughing and wouldn't get up from his cot. Mother Thea was bedridden with joint pain. The young daughter of one of the households had been running a fever for 3 days. Dan wasn't a doctor, but he knew one thing: a warm house and food heal better than cold and hunger. He made sure every sick person at home had enough firewood, and that someone brought hot porridge twice a day. It wasn't medicine, it was the logistics of care. In the middle of winter, Maya arrived in Greystone, the daughter of a local herbalist. She lived on the far edge of the village with her mother and hardly ever showed up in the common area. A quiet 21-year-old girl with dark hair and a habit of looking at a person's hands first and then into their eyes. She came to the mine shaft in the morning. She stood at the entrance. Dan came out with a wheelbarrow full of ore and saw her. She said that Bren was coughing, and that Ty was coughing, and that Finn was coughing too, but wouldn't admit it. A miner's cough, coal dust and rock grit in the lungs. Dan knew this problem. In his world, it killed thousands. Silicosis, pneumoconiosis, a slow death from dust. There were no respirators here. There was no ventilation. The tunnel was short, and the air was stagnant. Maya looked at him and waited. She treated them with herbs, cough syrups, chest compresses. It helped with the symptoms, but not with the cause. The cause was the dust. Dan asked what exactly she gave for the cough. Maya listed them: coltsfoot, thyme, elecampane. All correct. Everything that had been used in his world for centuries before the invention of modern medicine. Dan nodded and said he appreciated her work. But the problem wasn't the treatment. The problem was the air. If there was fresh air in the tunnel, there would be less dust and the cough would go away. He asked if she could tell him more about each of their symptoms. When the cough started, in the morning or in the evening, dry or wet, with or without blood. Maya looked at him strangely. No one had ever asked her about symptoms in such detail. People would come in and say, "I'm coughing, give me something." She'd give it to them. They'd leave. But this man was asking as if her knowledge mattered. She answered, in detail, accurately. Brenna has a dry morning cough. It's dust in the upper respiratory tract. Ty has an evening cough with phlegm. It's deeper. Finn has a nighttime cough with wheezing. That's the worst, because the boy is growing and his lungs are still developing. Dan listened. Then he said he'd set up ventilation. Tomorrow. Nothing complicated, just a second exit from the tunnel to the surface. Vertical. The elevation difference will create a draft, and the air will start moving. It would reduce the dust concentration by a factor of 3. Maya asked if it would definitely help. Dan replied that it definitely would. She nodded and left. The next day she returned with a small bag of dried herbs. She placed it at the entrance to the tunnel. She said it was for Finn, to brew in the morning and evening. Dan took the bag. Their eyes met for a second. Then she turned away and left. Dan broke through the ventilation shaft in 3 days, a vertical shaft 0.5 meter in diameter. From the tunnel roof to the surface through 4 meters of rock. Hard work from the bottom up. Rock rained down on his head. The birch helmets came in handy, literally. When the last blow of the pickaxe broke through the crust and daylight poured into the tunnel, daylight poured in. The air immediately began to move. A cold draft from outside plunged into the shaft and flowed through the tunnel toward the main entrance. The dust that had been hanging in the air began to settle. An hour later, it became noticeably easier to breathe inside. Finn stood beneath the ventilation shaft, looking up and smiling. 2 weeks later, all 3 of them were coughing less. By the 3rd month of winter, Greystone had stopped dying. It hadn't blossomed, it hadn't gotten rich, it had simply stopped dying. You could tell by the simple things. Smoke from every chimney. Before, by midwinter, 2 or 3 families would conserve firewood and heat their homes every other day. Now, everyone was heating their homes because Bren and the brothers Mark and Will took turns cutting dead wood on the southern slope and delivering it to the yards. Meat in every house. Salted venison hung in the pantries in dark strips. Ty had shot 4 deer and 1 boar in a month. Everything was salted, everything preserved. Before, half the catch went to waste because there was no salt. Now, there was salt, and for the first time in many years, Greystone ate every day. Dan stood by the furnace and counted. 30 smeltings in 2 months. About 600 kilograms of raw iron. Of that, Oswald had processed 300 into finished goods. Nails, horseshoes, knives, axes, staples. The rest lay in ingots under the shed. It was capital. Live iron that could be sold or traded when the spring roads opened. But Dan wasn't thinking about trade. He was thinking about steel. The pig iron was good, pure, soft, perfect for nails and horseshoes. But tools required steel. Weapons required steel. For Greystone to become something more than a village with a forge, steel was needed. And steel is iron plus carbon. And control. Temperature. Time. Carbon content measured in 0.1%. Too little and the metal remains soft. Too much and it becomes brittle. Dan knew the theory. He knew the Bessemer process and the open hearth process and the oxygen converter process. But all that was useless without equipment he didn't have and couldn't possibly have. Here and now, the only real way to make steel was carburization. Take a strip of good pig iron, enclose it in charcoal in a sealed crucible, heat it to a high temperature, keep it there for hours. The carbon from the charcoal would penetrate the surface of the iron and turn it into steel, slowly, millimeter by millimeter per hour, but surely. He explained this to Oswald. The blacksmith listened with his mouth agape. In his mind, steel was something brought in from distant cities for a fortune. The idea that steel could be made from their own iron simply by holding it in charcoal at the right temperature seemed to him like some kind of alchemy. Dan said it wasn't alchemy, it was chemistry. Oswald asked what chemistry was. Dan thought for a second and replied that chemistry was when you know why things change, not just see that they've changed. The blacksmith thought about it and said that sounded useful. They began their experiments. Dan fashioned the first crucible out of fire clay. a thick-walled pot with a lid sealed with the same clay. Inside, they placed a strip of iron sprinkled with fine charcoal. They put the crucible in the furnace and turned the heat up to maximum. They pumped the bellows continuously for 6 hours. Dan and Tai took turns. Then they let the crucible cool slowly, without removing it from the furnace. That was important. Rapid cooling would result in hardening, but for now he just needed carbon-rich metal. The next morning, they opened the crucible. The strip inside had darkened. Dan pulled it out and tested it on a file. The surface offered resistance. Iron doesn't behave like that. It was steel. A thin layer, 0.5 millimeter, maybe less, but steel. Oswald took the strip and struck it with a hammer. The metal rang out, a high, clear sound, not the dull thud of soft iron, the ringing of steel. The blacksmith stood with the hammer in his hand and listened as the sound echoed up to the smithy's ceiling. Then he looked at Dan. There was something new in his eyes. Not surprise. Something closer to awe. He said quietly that he had heard that sound only once in his life, when he was 12 and his father took him to the fair in the valley. There, a master armorer was showing off a sword made of imported steel and tapping it with his finger. And the sword sang, just like that. Dan nodded and said that this was only the beginning. The steel layer was too thin. They needed to increase the carburizing time, and the temperature, and the size of the crucible, and the number of experiments, because each new crucible gave a slightly different result, and they needed to find the optimum. They worked on the steel for 3 weeks, 12 crucibles, different holding times, from 4 hours to 20, different temperatures, different coal sizes. Dan recorded the results on flat stones because there was no paper. Stone number 1, 4 hours, a 0.5 millimeter layer, a bit too soft. Stone number 2, 8 hours, 1 millimeter, better. Stone number 3, 12 hours, 1.5 millimeters, a bit brittle, oversaturation. On the 8th crucible, he found the balance. 10 hours of holding at a temperature that Oswald had learned to determine by the color of the glow. Bright yellow, not white, not orange, bright yellow. Under these conditions, carbon penetrated to a depth of just over 1 millimeter, producing steel with good hardness and acceptable toughness. From this steel, Oswald forged his first knife. Not an ordinary village knife, a real one. Properly quenched in oil, tempered over coals, with a smooth blade that cut through skin under its own weight. Dan held the knife and twirled it between his fingers. The steel gleamed a grayish blue, smooth, no pits, no cracks. It wasn't Damascus steel or Bulat. It was simple, case-hardened steel with a carbon content of around 6%. But for this world, where steel was brought in from distant cities and sold by the weight of silver, it was a small breakthrough. Word of the knife reached Holt. The village elder came to the smithy. He looked. He tested the blade. Then he sat down on a log and was silent for a long time. He was beginning to understand the scale of what was happening. Iron ore is one thing. Your own iron is another. Your own steel is a third. A village that makes its own steel is not a village. It is something more. And that something more will attract attention. Holt looked at Dan and said that problems would begin in the spring. Dan replied that he knew. That is why, by spring, they should have enough to solve these problems. Not with force, with steel. Not literally, although literally too. Winter was ending. The days were getting longer. The snow on the southern slopes had begun to melt, the stream was gaining strength, and the flushing trough was working faster. The furnace was producing a steady 25 kilograms of iron per melt. Oswald was forging without a day off. His hammer pounded from dawn to dusk. He had changed over these months. Before, he had been just a village blacksmith who repaired whatever was brought to him. Now he was a master. He knew his metal. He knew its character. He knew that this strip from the third melt was slightly softer and better for nails, and that this one from the fifth melt was harder and would be used for chisels. Dan watched him and saw a man finding meaning. Not work, meaning. It was a quiet miracle. Finn was changing too. The orphan who 4 months ago had silently dug through the rock for a bowl of porridge was now a full-fledged miner. He knew the tunnel better than anyone. He knew every turn, every crack in the roof, every sound the rock made when the mountain pressed down on it. Gregor had taught him to read the strata. Ty taught him to use a pickaxe sparingly. Dan taught him to think one step ahead. The boy was coming into his own, physically and mentally. He was eating properly for the first time in his life. He worked with people who didn't push him too hard. He got his share from every blast. A small one, but his own. One evening, Finn came to Dan with a piece of slate. Uneven lines were scratched into it with a nail. Finn said he'd tried to draw the tunnel from above, as if from a height, so you could see where the vein ran and where the supports were. Dan looked at the drawing. It was crooked and out of proportion, but the idea was right. A plan of the mine workings, a bird's-eye view. The boy had figured out cartography on his own. Dan smiled and sat down next to him. He took a second piece of slate and drew the same tunnel, but to scale. He showed him how to measure distances, how to mark turns, how to draw the supports using symbols. Finn watched intently. His eyes were shining. He asked if he could try. Dan handed him a nail and a piece of slate. Finn drew until dark. By the end of his first winter in Greystone, another event had taken place. A small one, inconspicuous, but for Dan, more important than the first smelting. Holt came to see him in the morning. He stood in the doorway. He hesitated. Then he said that tomorrow his wife was baking bread, fresh, from the last of the flour, and that Dan was invited. Dan stood and looked silently at the village elder. It wasn't an invitation to dinner. It was an acknowledgement. In mountain villages, bread made from the last of the flour is baked for their own, for the family. Holt was inviting him to his table. Dan nodded, said he'd come. Holt nodded back and left. In the evening, Dan sat alone by the fire. The map glowed faintly at the edge of his vision, showing the familiar layers: red iron, black coal, white salt. And far below, deep in the heart of the ridge, blue flickering dots, crystals. It was 1.5 miles vertically to them, an eternity given their current capabilities, but they were there, and the map reminded him of them every time Dan looked at the mountains. He thought about spring, about trade, about the people who would come once word got out, about Velmar and its taxes, about the trading houses and their appetites, about how a small village with good steel was both a treasure and a target. He needed more people, more hands, more minds. He needed someone who knew how to trade, someone who knew how to heal, someone who knew how to defend, someone who knew how to build. He couldn't do it alone. He knew that. 8 years on the mining sites had taught him the most important lesson. One man can find a deposit, but only a team can set up production there. The snow was melting. The streams were swelling. The first spring traders were making their way up the road from the south. The first trader arrived from the south on the 3rd day after the snow on the trail had melted. His name was Renard, a sturdy man in his 40s, with a wagon and 2 mules.
He traveled through the mountain villages every spring. He bought up hides, he sold cloth and salt and cheap iron. Greystone was the last stop on his route because it was the poorest and farthest away. He usually stayed here for half a day. He'd buy a dozen pelts for pennies and leave. This time, he stopped his wagon by the village headman's house and looked around. Something was wrong. The village looked different. Not wealthy, but different. New doors on the houses. Iron hinges instead of leather ones. New nails gleamed on the roof of the nearest shed. There was a shed by the smithy that hadn't been there before. Under the shed, iron strips lay in neat rows. Renard was a merchant. His eyes calculated faster than his mind. He saw iron. Lots of iron. In a village that a year ago couldn't afford a sack of nails. He walked toward the smithy. Oswald stood at the forge and was hammering. Renard looked at the work, then at the metal. Then he picked up a finished knife from the counter and tested the blade. His eyebrows rose. It was good steel, not imported, local. He could tell by the characteristic grayish tint. Valley steel was bluish because the Valley craftsman added a little chromium to it. This was different, pure, no additives, and very good. Renard asked Oswald where the metal came from. The blacksmith grumbled that it was his own, from the mountain. Renard said nothing. Then he asked how much the knife cost. Oswald named the price. 4 silver pieces. Renard whistled. In the valley, they would have asked 6 for a knife like that. Maybe 7. He bought the knife. Then he bought 20 pounds of nails. Then a dozen horseshoes. He paid with silver and a promise to return in a month. Dan watched from around the corner of the smithy. He didn't interfere. He let Oswald make the sale himself. That was important. The blacksmith had to feel for himself how trade worked. Name the price himself. Receive the money himself. Realize for himself that his hands were worth silver. After Renard left, Dan went to Oswald. They sat on logs by the forge and did the math. Over the winter, the smithy had produced goods worth a sum Oswald was even afraid to name. More than 50 silver coins at Renard's prices. In a single winter. A village blacksmith who a year ago couldn't even fix a plow had earned more than Greystone had seen in the last 3 years. Oswald sat and was silent. His scorched hands rested on his knees. Dan could see that the blacksmith was going through something he couldn't talk about. Not joy. Something deeper. The realization that his whole life up to that moment had not been what it could have been. That he had spent 20 years forging in a cold forge from shoddy imported iron, not because he was a bad blacksmith, but because no one had given him real metal and real fire. Dan didn't bring it up. He just put his hand on the man's shoulder for a second. Then he took it away and got down to business. 2 weeks after Renard, a second merchant arrived along the road. This one was of a different caliber. Not a wandering pelt buyer, but a representative. A young man of about 25 in fine traveling clothes, riding a decent horse with 2 bodyguards. He introduced himself as Victor, an agent of the Morvain trading house. Dan stood at the entrance to Holt's house and watched as Victor dismounted. He knew this would happen. Not exactly when, but that it would happen. Renard had spread the rumor about good steel from the mountain village. The rumor reached the trading house. The trading house sent a man to check it out. The mechanics were as simple and predictable as gravity. Victor was polite, well-trained. He knew how to smile. He knew how to pay compliments. He surveyed the village with interest. He visited the smithy. He talked at length with Oswald. He asked to see the metal. He tried a knife. He tried an axe.
Then he asked to meet with the man who organized the production. Oswald looked at Dan. Dan nodded. They met at the Holt house. Dan, Victor, Holt as a witness. Victor began with praise. He said that the House of Morvain was impressed by the quality of the steel, that such metal was a rarity even in the valley, that Dan had obvious talent. Then he got down to business. House Morvain is offering an exclusive contract. All metal from Greystone is to be sold only through the Morvains. The price is fixed, 10 silver pieces per pound of steel products. In return, the house provides protection from other buyers and from the crown. It guarantees stable demand, and it pays an advance of 20 gold pieces. 20 gold pieces. For Greystone, that was a fortune. Holt involuntarily swallowed. Dan sat calmly. He knew this scheme. He'd seen it hundreds of times in the other world. A big company comes to a small manufacturer, offers good money for exclusivity. The small manufacturer agrees because they need the money now. A year later, it turns out the price is fixed below market value, that the volume of obligations drains all production, that without the house's permission, not a single nail can be sold to an outside party, and that the contract can only be terminated by paying a penalty that doesn't exist. The small manufacturer effectively becomes a division of the house, works for a pittance. The profits go to the top. Dan thanked Victor for the offer. He said it was generous and that Morvain House enjoys a well-deserved reputation. Then he politely declined. He explained that Greystone is too small for exclusive contracts, that the production volume is still insignificant, that they prefer to work with various buyers in small quantities so as not to put all their eggs in one basket. Victor smiled. His smile hadn't changed, but his eyes grew slightly colder. He said he understood their caution, that the House of Morvain wasn't insisting, that the offer remained open. Then he stood up and took his leave. His guards helped him mount his horse, and they rode down the road. Holt watched them go. Then he turned to Dan and said that 20 gold pieces was a lot of money. Dan replied that freedom was worth more. Holt didn't argue. He had lived long enough to know that was true. A week later, Dan began the expansion. The first furnace was running at full capacity. The goatskin bellows were wearing out. The clay walls cracked from overheating after every 10th melt and had to be patched. A second furnace was needed, bigger, more powerful, with proper bellows. He found a solution to the bellows problem unexpectedly. On the western slope, the map showed a stream with a 3-meter drop over a short stretch. A water wheel. The simplest kind, a paddle wheel. It could turn a camshaft that would pump the bellows automatically, without people, without brakes, with a steady, continuous flow of air. Dan sketched a diagram on a flat rock all evening. He had seen a water wheel 1,000 times, in museums, in textbooks, in old photographs of 18th century factories. The design was elementary, wooden blades on an axle. Water falls on the blades from above, the wheel turns, the axle transmits the rotation to the cams press on the bellows levers, the bellows pump air. The only difficulty was precision. The blades must be identical, the axle must be straight, the cams must be spaced evenly. Without this, the wheel will wobble and break. He needed a carpenter, a good one. There was no carpenter in Gracetown. There was Bren, who knew how to handle an axe. There were the brothers Mark and Will, who built log cabins. But carpentry is something else. It's cutting to size. It's fitting. It's work done not with an axe, but with a plane and a draw knife. Dan decided to teach them. He gathered Bren and Finn by the stream. He pointed to the drop in elevation and explained what he wanted to build. Bren listened with a frown. Finn listened with eyes aglow. Dan sketched a full-scale wheel on the snow-cleared patch of ground, with a stick on the ground, a circle 2 meters in diameter, spokes, a spindle, a frame. He explained every detail, why it was needed, what size, what kind of wood. The blades were made of light pine. The axle was made of oak. The frame was made of larch because larch doesn't rot in water. They built the wheel over 12 days. For the first 4 days, Dan worked alongside them. He shaped the blades. He showed them how to check the measurements with a simple rope measure, how to achieve a smooth surface with a plane. Then he handed the work over to Bren and went off to build a second oven. Bren managed. Not perfectly, but he managed. He was persistent and meticulous. A lumberjack's hands turned out to be precise enough for carpentry work. Finn helped out and drew at the same time. He sketched every detail of the wheel on a slate plate, not at Dan's request, on his own. When Dan saw these drawings, he stopped. Finn had drawn a cross-section of the wheel, with the parts labeled, with dimensions. A bit crooked, but clear. It was a technical drawing. A 15-year-old boy who had never seen a technical drawing had drawn a technical drawing. Dan looked at Finn and told him he had talent. Real talent. Rare talent. Finn blushed and didn't say a word. Alongside the construction of the wheel, Dan was building a second furnace. This one was more substantial than the first. 2 meters tall, walls 2 bricks thick, 3 rows of tuyere, an enlarged charging chamber. Estimated metal yield, 50 kilograms per melt, twice as much as the first furnace. He brought in 5 more people to help with the construction. By this point, Greystone had a population of 52. In addition to the 40-odd permanent residents, several people from neighboring farms had joined them after hearing that there was work in the village that paid in silver. 2 former lumberjacks, a family with 3 children from an abandoned village beyond the pass, a lonely old man named Hammett, who had been a stonemason all his life, and came because he was told they were building with stone here. Hammett turned out to be a godsend. His hands were twisted from arthritis, but he knew stone as well as Oswald knew metal. He placed every cobblestone in its place, and it settled as if it had been born there. He built the walls of the second furnace in 5 days, smooth, without cracks, with properly laid joints. Dan watched his work and silently thanked the world that there are masters everywhere. You just have to give them a reason to come. The wheel was started at the end of the month. Dan himself directed the water into the chute. The stream struck the first blade. The wheel jerked. It creaked. It turned. Then again. And again. The creaking turned into a steady hum. The cams on the axle began to press against the bellows levers. The bellows sighed, and the air flowed. Steady, continuous, without pause, without any jerks. The stream of air through the clay pipes struck the blast holes of the second furnace. The coals inside flared up. The temperature began to rise. Dan stood and listened. The sound of water, the creaking of wood, the hum of air in the pipes. It was music. To him, it was music. Mechanization. The first in Gracetown. The first in these mountains. Perhaps the first on this continent in this form. It's not a man pumping the bellows for 16 hours. Water pumps the bellows 24 hours a day, without tiring, without breaks, without pay. People stood around. Bren, Finn, Ty, Mark, Will, Hammett, Oswald. They watched the wheel that turned and pumped air on its own, without hands, without people, just water. Bren said it was witchcraft. Dan shook his head and replied that it was engineering.
Bren asked what the difference was. Gregor laughed. The first smelting in the second water-blown furnace yielded 60 kilograms of pig iron, more than Dan had expected. The steady, continuous flow of air raised the temperature higher than hand-operated bellows. The ore melted more cleanly. There was less slag. The metal turned out better. Oswald took the first ingot and forged it. Then he sat for a long time, staring at the strip of iron. He said this was on another level. Not just good iron. Excellent. On par with the best valley workshops. Dan nodded and was already doing the math in his head. 60 kilograms per melt. 1 melt a day. 420 a week if they worked 7 days a week. But people need days off. So 5 smeltings a week. 300 kilograms. 1,200 a month. Over a ton of iron a month from a mountain village. If half of it is processed into steel and finished goods, Greystone's monthly income will be about 200 silver. That's more than the whole village used to earn in a year under the old system. Dan stood by the furnace and watched his men. Bren was feeding coal into the furnace from above. Ty and Will were wheeling a wheelbarrow full of ore out of the tunnel. Mark was monitoring the water level in the trough. Finn was sketching a diagram of the process on his slate. Gregor was sitting at the tunnel entrance, telling Hammett about the support. Oswald stood by the anvil, waiting for the metal. And Maya. Maya stood a little to the side, with a small bag of herbs, watching it all. The people who were working, at the furnace that was humming, at the wheel that was turning, at the smoke rising in a steady column. She turned toward Dan. Their eyes met. She nodded slightly and walked toward the tunnel. Finn's coughing started up again. She should have listened to him. Dan watched her go. Then he returned to the furnace. There was a lot of work to do. That evening, he sat by the fire and made a list of what needed to be done. A coal mine on the western slope. The charcoal is running out, and coal will solve the problem once and for all. Expanding the salt works. 1 well yields little brine. A second one is needed. And a canopy over the evaporation pans so the rain doesn't spoil the process. The road. The path to the highway was narrow and steep. A heavy wagon won't make it. If production volume increases, a proper road is needed. Housing. New people were arriving, and they needed somewhere to live. 2 houses were already being built, but that wasn't enough. And 1 more. School. Not now, but soon, because Finn drew blueprints out of natural talent. And if he were given the knowledge, he would grow into a real engineer. And he wasn't the only one. There were children in the village who couldn't read or count, and if Greystone was going to become something more than a village with a stove, it needed literate people. The list was growing. Dan looked at it and realized he couldn't handle this alone. He needed specialists, people who knew what he didn't: trade, medicine, military affairs. Managing people on a scale larger than a dozen miners. He raised his head and looked at the mountains. The map glowed faintly, showing the strata. Somewhere far away, on the road toward the valley, Victor from the House of Morvain was driving. He was carrying a report, neat, detailed, about a small mountain village that had turned down 20 gold pieces. This report would land on the desk of someone more important, and that someone will give it some thought. Because a village that turns down money is a village that either has no sense or has something better than money. And the Morvains aren't interested in people without sense. They're interested in the others. Dan knew that the quiet time was coming to an end. Spring was opening the roads. The roads carried merchants. The merchants carried rumors. The rumors carried attention. And attention carried danger.
Soon, people more serious than Victor would arrive in Greystone, and by that time, he needed to be ready. He put out the fire. He went to sleep. 4 hours until dawn. Tomorrow, he would start digging a coal mine. The map showed the coal seam on the western slope at a depth of 40 meters. But Dan wasn't going to dig vertically. A vertical shaft is difficult and dangerous. He needed a hoist cage. He needed a ladder. He needed a fall protection system. He didn't have any of that yet. Instead, he found a spot where the mountainside formed a natural ledge and the seam came closer to the surface. The map showed 22 meters of inclined tunneling at a 15-degree angle. The tunnel would go down the slope and come out right onto the coal. The rock could be hauled out with a wheelbarrow down the slope. The coal would go down too. Gravity works for free. Gregor approved the plan. He said that inclined tunnels are safer than vertical ones. The water drains on its own, air flows through as a draft, and if a cave-in happens, people can get out more easily than from a shaft. Dan divided the men into 2 crews. The first, led by Tay, continued working on the iron adit. The second, under his own command, headed for the western slope. Bren, Mark, 2 new guys from out of town, and Gregor on his wheelbarrow at the entrance. Finn was torn between the 2. He wanted to be everywhere, to sketch everything. Dan allowed him to move freely and keep records of both workings. The guy darted between the slopes with slabs of shale under his arm, beaming with happiness. The coal tunnel was being driven faster than the iron one. The rock was softer, limestone with layers of sandstone. The pickaxe went in easily. Support was set every 2 meters at Gregor's insistence. Dan didn't argue. Better to be safe than sorry. On the 12th day, Bren stopped and sniffed. He said it smelled strange. Dan stepped forward and smelled it too, a sweet, heavy odor. Methane. The map didn't show any gas pockets at this depth, but the map showed large accumulations, not small seeps from the seam. Coal always contains methane. That was normal. But normal doesn't mean safe. Dan stopped work. He got everyone out of the tunnel. He explained that the gas they could smell was flammable. If it built up and someone walked in with a torch, the tunnel would turn into an oven, with people inside. Bren turned pale. Mark spat and said that coal wasn't worth burning for. Dan replied that they wouldn't have to burn if they did it right. They needed ventilation, just like in an iron mine, a vertical shaft to the surface. And a rule. No torches in a coal mine. No open flames. Light only from oil lamps behind a mica screen. Bren asked what a mica screen was. Dan explained. A thin sheet of mica inserted into a wooden frame in front of the flame. The mica lets the light through, but prevents the flame from coming into contact with the outside air. If there's gas, the flame behind the mica will change color. It blew. That's the signal. If you see a blue flame, get out. Gregor listened and nodded. He knew about mine gas. In the valley mines, it killed people by the dozen. But he hadn't heard of a mica screen. In the valleys, they'd just send a man in first with a torch, and if it didn't explode, the rest would follow. Dan clenched his teeth when he heard that. Then he said it wouldn't be like that in Greystone. Never. They had drilled through the ventilation shaft in 2 days. Air was flowing. The smell of methane faded. Dan made 2 lamps out of clay pots with hemp wicks and mica screens. He found the mica on the eastern slope. The map showed a muscovite vein outcrop right on the surface. Thin, transparent plates that could be peeled off with a fingernail. On the 14th day, they reached the coal. Black, shiny, bituminous coal. Not anthracite, but a good grade. It burns hot. For a long time. Almost smoke-free. And there was plenty of it. A layer 1.5 meters thick extended deep into the mountain for hundreds of meters, according to the map. Dan chipped off the first piece and weighed it in his hand. Then he held it up to the lamp. The coal flared up and burned with an even bluish-yellow flame. Bren and Mark watched. Dan told them that this coal gives off twice as much heat as wood, and it burns 3 times longer. With it, the stove will work twice as efficiently, and the village would no longer have to cut down trees for fuel. The forest was needed for supports and construction, and the mountain would provide the heat. The first wheelbarrow of coal was rolled up to the furnace that same day. Oswald mixed the coal with ore concentrate and loaded it into the furnace. The water wheel pumped the bellows. The temperature rose faster than usual, higher than usual. The slag came out denser and cleaner. After forging, the metal rang so clearly that Oswald stopped the hammer and listened. Then he looked at Dan and shook his head. He said that every time he thinks things can't get any better, they do. Dan replied that this was only the beginning, and he wasn't exaggerating. Coal changed everything, not just metallurgy, heating, cooking, the village economy. 1 sack of coal replaced 3 sacks of firewood. Greystone sat on a mountain of fuel and no longer depended on the forest. And the forest could be used for construction, and there was plenty to build. Over the course of a spring month, 20 more people arrived in Greystone, families from nearby villages, lonesomes, people who had heard there was work and silver in the mountains. Dan took everyone in, but not for free. Every new resident received work and housing, but they had to commit to working for 3 months according to the settlement's rules. The rules were simple. Don't steal, don't fight, wear a hard hat in the mine, obey the shift foreman. These weren't laws. They were common sense written on wooden signs at the entrance to every tunnel. Holt looked at the growing settlement and felt nervous. He was used to managing 40 people. Now there were more than 70, and new ones arrived every week. He went to Dan and said he couldn't handle it, that he couldn't keep track of everyone, that he didn't know the newcomers, that he was afraid there was a thief or a spy among them, or just a slacker who would eat and not work. Dan listened. Then he suggested a system. Neither he nor Holt would be watching everyone. The foreman would. Each crew consists of 5 to 7 people. Each crew has its own foreman. Ty leads the iron mine. Bren leads the coal mine. Mark leads the construction crew. Each foreman is responsible for his own people. He knows them. He keeps an eye on them. They report to Dan once a week. Holt settles disputes between the crews and among the residents. Just like before, only now he's not alone. He has the foreman's help. Holt thought it over. He asked, "What if a foreman can't handle it?" Dan replied, "Then we'll replace him. It's not a punishment, it's a job. Not everyone is cut out to be a foreman. There's no shame in returning to the..." Holt nodded. He understood the system. It reminded him of how the hunting parties worked in his youth, only on a larger scale. A week after the coal mine opened, a girl appeared on the road, alone, on foot, wearing men's travel clothes with a knapsack on her back. She was climbing the path to Greystone slowly. It was clear she had come from far away. Dan saw her from the platform by the furnace. He went down to meet her. She stopped and looked at him. A thin face, dark eyes, short hair, chapped lips. She asked if this was the village of Greystone and if it was true that they were building furnaces that work better than the academic ones. Dan asked who she was. She introduced herself as So-Yun Han, a former student of the Royal Engineering Academy of Velmar. Former because she had left. Dan asked why she had left. So-Yun paused. Then she said briefly, "Because they wouldn't let me work." Her water supply project for a suburban neighborhood had been given to an aristocratic classmate, along with her blueprints. When she went to the dean, he explained that a female engineer wasn't a serious profession.
and that she'd be better off doing something more suitable. So-yun left the academy. She walked for 4 days from the last town in the valley. She slept in roadside sheds. She ate whatever she was given for odd jobs. Dan looked at her and saw. Not a map. The map was silent here. He saw a person, an engineer, hungry and angry and tired. A person who had been stripped of her work and who had come 300 kilometers to find a place where work meant more than a surname. He said, "Welcome. I'll show you around." So-yun followed him. He showed her the tunnel, the wash chute, the first furnace, the second furnace, the water wheel, the salt works. So-yun watched in silence. Her eyes darted over the details. Dan could see her calculating. The angle of the trough, the size of the wheel's blades, the thickness of the furnace walls. She was an engineer. She wasn't just looking, she was analyzing. She stopped at the second furnace. She looked at the two airs for a long time. Then she said the angle of the two airs was wrong, 3 degrees below the optimum. Because of this, the airstream hits the coal instead of the melting zone, and some of the heat is wasted. Dan looked at the two airs, then at So-yun, then back at the two airs. She was right. He knew it. He had set the two airs by eye because there was no tool for precise angle measurement, and he was off by 3 degrees. So-yun noticed it at a glance. He told her she was right. So-yun blinked. Then she frowned. Then she blinked again. That wasn't the answer she'd expected. At the academy, when she pointed out mistakes in other people's projects, the men would look at her like she was an insect. Here stood a man who had built all of this from scratch out of dirt and stones, and he simply said she was right. No offense, no argument, no explanation of why it wasn't actually a mistake. Just right. Dan pulled a piece of chalk from his belt. He handed it to her. He said, "Show me." So-yun took the chalk. She walked over to the furnace. She drew a diagram on the stone. The optimal angle of the tuyères, the direction of the airflow, the zone of maximum temperature. Her lines were confident and precise. Dan looked at the diagram and nodded. Then he told her something else. He said that her calculation of the melting zone was better than his own, that she had determined the location of the point of maximum temperature more accurately, and that the idea of a slanted visor over the tuyère to reflect heat downward was brilliant, and he wouldn't have thought of it himself. So-yun stood with chalk in her hand. Her face didn't change, but her fingers trembled slightly. It was the first time in her life that a man had discussed work with her as an equal. Not condescendingly, not with reservations, not with the implication that she was doing well for a girl, just as he would with an engineer. She asked in an even voice if she could stay. Dan replied that she would need a place to sleep and a work desk. He would set up the desk tomorrow. So-yun nodded and tucked the chalk behind her belt. That same evening, she unrolled the tube of blueprints on the table in Holt's house. A water supply project, 10 sheets, designed for a suburban neighborhood with a population of 2,000. Dan sat down beside her, and they pored over the blueprints until late into the night. He pointed at the joints and asked questions. She explained. He pointed out 3 errors. She argued about 2 of them. She agreed on 1. Holt was sleeping behind the wall and knocked on it twice to tell them to speak more quietly. They didn't notice. In the morning, So-yun went out to the site and began rearranging the fireboxes of the second furnace. Dan assigned Finn to assist her. So-yun looked at the young man, then at his slate sheets with the blueprints, then back at the young man. She asked who had taught him. Finn replied that no one had. He taught himself. So-yun turned to Dan. Her gaze spoke louder than words. She saw the same thing he did. Raw talent. She told Finn that starting tomorrow, he would be working with her. He would learn to draw properly, with a ruler, with scale,
with symbols. Finn opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Dan. Dan nodded. Finn broke into a smile so wide it looked like his face was about to crack. So Yoon snorted and ordered him to haul the clay. Yoon worked as if she were taking revenge on everyone who had ever told her that a woman couldn't be an engineer. In the first week, she redesigned the water supply system for the washing trough. Instead of one long trough, she built a cascade of 3. The ore passed through a coarse wash, then a medium wash, then a fine wash. The yield of clean concentrate increased by 1/3. Losses of valuable ore to the waste pile were cut in half. Dan looked at the results and silently acknowledged that she understood beneficiation better than he did. His strength lay in geology and tunneling. Her strength lay in processes and flows. Together, they covered almost the entire cycle. In the second week, she proposed a water supply project for the village. Not the scale as for the valley suburbs, simpler. Wooden pipes made from hollowed-out tree trunks. A spring on the slope above the village, a 30-meter elevation difference. Enough pressure for the water to flow by gravity to 3 points. A well in the square, the smithy, the infirmary. Dan approved the project in 10 minutes. The only thing he added was a 4th point, Maya's house. Because Maya carried water in buckets 3 times a day for her decoctions and compresses. So Yoon looked at him when he said that, a long, attentive look. Then she silently added a 4th branch to the drawing. Building the water supply took 8 days. Mark and his construction crew dug a trench. Bren carved pipes out of pine trunks. Finn drew up the layout plan under So Yoon's guidance. Dan chose the route on the map so as to bypass rocky areas and avoid crossing any of the underground cavities he knew of. From the outside, it looked like intuition. In reality, he could see every rock beneath the ground. When the water main was turned on and water began flowing through the wooden pipes down the slope and gushed from the first tap, a crowd gathered in the square. All 70-odd residents. They stood and watched as the water poured out on its own. No buckets, no well bucket. You just open the plug and the water flows. Clean, cold, mountain water. Holt's wife stood there with a clay jug and cried. For 30 years she had walked to the stream to fetch water. Every day. Twice a day. Along a slippery path. On ice in the winter. Carrying heavy buckets. And now the water had come to her on its own. So Yoon stood to the side, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was inscrutable. But Dan could see that she was standing a little straighter than usual, a little taller. It was her project, her water system, and it was working. At the academy, they hadn't let her build a water system for 2,000 people. Here, she had built it for 70. And those 70 were standing there, crying with joy. It was better than any diploma. Maya went to the water line by the infirmary that evening. She turned on the tap, filled a jug, tasted the water. Then she looked at the pipe, at the tap, at Dan, who was standing nearby checking the connections. She said quietly that she hadn't asked for this. Dan replied that he knew. She stood there with the jug in her hands and said nothing. Then she said she needed more space. Not for herself, for the infirmary. Right now she's treating people in her own home, in one room. She sleeps there too. She keeps her herbs there too. The patient lies on a bench next to her bed and she hears him coughing all night. She needs a separate room. Clean. With hot water. With a place where she can lance an abscess without having to do it on the dining table. Dan listened. Then he asked what exactly she needed. Not in general, specifically. How many rooms? What size? What each one would be used for? Where the stove should go? Where the shelves for the herbs? Where the beds for the patients? Maya described it, in detail. She'd been thinking about it for a long time. It's just that no one had asked. Dan listened and took it all in. Then he said he'd build it. Not just any infirmary, her infirmary, to her specifications. So Yun designed the building in 2 days. Stone walls, a wooden roof with a chimney, 3 rooms, a reception area with benches for those waiting, a workroom with a large table and good light from 2 windows, a ward with 4 beds for the seriously ill, copper pipes from the water supply with a simple boiler for heating, hot water from the tap. Maya stood over the blueprint and traced the lines with her finger. Her eyes sparkled. She said quietly that it was better than in the valley hospitals. So Yun replied in an even voice that the hospitals in the valley didn't have hot water from the taps. This is Greystone. It's better here. Construction of the infirmary took 3 weeks. Hammett built the walls. Mark and Will cut and installed the roof. Bren made the doors and shutters. Oswald forged hinges and brackets and a special hook for hanging the boiler that Maya had personally requested. Dan ran copper pipes from the water supply and made a boiler out of wrought copper. He found the copper on the map, a small outcrop of a copper vein on the southern slope. Shallow. He went down there himself. He dug up some green stones, malachite. Oswald remelted it. He got a little. 3 kilograms of pure copper, enough for the pipes and a small boiler. When the infirmary was ready, Maya went in first, alone. Dan and the others waited outside. She walked through all 3 rooms. She touched the walls. She turned on the hot water tap. Steam rose from the stream, and she held out her hands. Then she came out. Her face was calm, but her eyes were red. She said she would move everything here tomorrow. Dan nodded. That evening, something happened that he hadn't expected. Holt gathered the people in the square by the water tap. Not on Dan's orders, on his own initiative. The village head stood on an upturned crate and gave a speech, a short one. He said that in 30 years of governing Greystone, he had never once seen what he was seeing now. His own iron, his own steel, his own salt, his own coal. Water in the taps, a hospital, work for everyone, money in his pocket. He said he didn't understand how one man could have done all this. Then he corrected himself. Not one, but he started it alone. Holt looked at Dan and said that if his father were alive, he would be proud. Dan stood in the crowd and said nothing. He was thinking of another father, of the man from Pittsburgh who taught him to pump the bellows in the garage, who died of a heart attack 2 years before Dan graduated from college, who never saw him in the mountains of Chile, who would never know that his son had been given a second chance in another world. Someone tugged at his sleeve. Maya. She was standing next to him, silently holding onto his sleeve, not his hand, by the sleeve, like a child afraid of losing an adult in a crowd. Only she wasn't afraid. She was just standing there. Dan didn't pull his arm away. After the meeting, life went on, but something had changed. People started treating Dan differently. Not like a guy who knows about ore, like a man behind whom the whole village stood. It was both good and dangerous. Good because his decisions were carried out faster. Dangerous because if he made a mistake, people would fall with him. So Yun noticed it first. She came to him that evening and told him bluntly that he couldn't be the sole decision-maker. If he were gone for a single day, the whole village would grind to a halt. It's bad architecture, like a furnace with a single flue. If the flue gets blocked, the furnace goes out. We need backup lines. Dan agreed. He'd been thinking about it himself. They sat down and mapped out the structure. Tai is in charge of mining, all the tunnels, all the underground crews. So Yun is in charge of engineering, furnaces, water supply, construction, machinery. Oswald is in charge of metalworking, the forge, cementation, finished products. Holt is in charge of daily life, housing, food, disputes between people. Dan coordinates everyone and does the planning, but if he's not there, everyone knows their own area and can work independently. So-yoon wrote this on a large sheet of birch bark, Greystone's first organizational chart. Dan looked at it and smiled. He said that in his world, this is called a corporate structure. So-yoon asked what a corporate structure was. Dan thought for a moment and replied that it was when many people work together and everyone knows their place. So-yoon snorted and said it was just common sense. Dan agreed. Rumors spread faster than Dan wanted. By midsummer, Greystone's population had surpassed 100. Every week, new people came up the trail. Families with children, single men, elderly couples who had nothing to lose, teenage boys who had fled poverty in neighboring villages. They had all heard the same thing. There's a place in the mountains where they pay in silver. Dan stood at the entrance to the settlement every morning and greeted the new arrivals. He spoke with each one, asked what they could do, where they came from, why. Most knew only a little. Digging, chopping, carrying. That was normal. You don't find specialists among those fleeing poverty. But among them were people with skills, a carpenter from a ruined village beyond the pass, a potter who'd lost his workshop to debt, an old seamstress with 3 daughters. Dan put each person where their skills worked best. The carpenter went to work on Bren's construction site. The potter began making crucibles and for the furnaces. The seamstress received an order for work clothes for the miners. Gregor suggested keeping records: who came, when, what skills they had, and where they worked. Dan nodded and assigned the task to Finn. The young man now worked with So-yoon on the blueprints in the mornings and kept records in the afternoons. He devised his own system. Every resident was assigned a number. The number was written on a wooden tag that the person wore around their neck. The same tag hung on a board at Holt's house. Next to the number was the name and the work crew. Simple and effective. Dan saw this system and laughed. Finn asked what was so funny. Dan replied that nothing was. It was just that the guy had just invented personnel records. Finn didn't understand, but smiled. At the beginning of summer, 2 events occurred that changed the situation. First, a girl with a sword appeared on the road. Short, muscular, short-haired, with a long scar running from her temple to her chin. She didn't come for work. She came because an acquaintance of hers had been beaten up in the village the previous week. A traveling peddler of trinkets. 3 newcomers whom Dan had taken in a month ago got drunk that evening and beat up the peddler over a trivial argument about the price of a belt. The peddler lost 2 teeth and 3 silver pieces worth of goods. Dan found out about it that morning. He tracked down the 3, kicked them out of the settlement. No questions asked, no second chances. The rule was simple. Don't fight. Break it, and you're out. But the merchant had already spread the word along the road, and his acquaintance with the sword came to settle the score. Her name was Ashley Brannan. Ash, 19 years old, daughter of a late mercenary sergeant, an orphan since she was 14. She stood in the square by the water fountain and waited, her hand on the hilt of her sword. Her face was stern. Dan walked out to her. She said she'd come for the money owed to her friend, 3 silver coins for the goods, and for 2 teeth. A tooth costs 1 silver coin, 5 in total. Dan nodded. He went inside. He came back with 5 silver coins. He handed them to her. She took them. Then she looked at him suspiciously. She asked why it was so easy. Dan replied that it was because she was right. Her friend had been wronged in his village, so he was responsible. Ash stood there, blinking. She had been preparing for a fight, or a long argument, or threats. Instead, she received 5 coins and an admission. She didn't know what to make of it. Then she looked around. She saw the smithy, a water wheel spinning and pumping the bellows. People working. Her eyes narrowed. She said that a village without guards was a sitting duck, that 3 drunken fools were just the tip of the iceberg, that if word of the silver and steel spread further, more serious people would come, with swords. Dan replied that he knew. Ash asked what he planned to do. Dan answered honestly that he didn't know, because he's an engineer, not a warrior. He knows how to build furnaces, not defenses. Ash looked at him for a long time. Then she asked how much he was paying. Dan said 5 silver coins a month, plus room and board. Ash snorted. She said that for 5 silver coins, a mercenary wouldn't even look at him. Dan replied that she wasn't a mercenary. A mercenary leaves when the money runs out. He needs someone who will stay when trouble starts. Ash was silent for a minute. Then she said she needed a place to train, and 10 people she could teach. Dan held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she shook it. The second incident occurred 3 days later. Another guest appeared on the road, but this one was a different sort. A woman of about 26, riding a fine horse, in a traveling outfit that cost more than Greystone's entire wardrobe, with 2 bodyguards. She introduced herself as Leanne Vale, an agent of the Morvain trading house. Dan stood before her and thought quickly. The Morvains hadn't sent Victor, the boy. They'd sent a grown professional. That meant Victor's report had piqued their interest. That meant the stakes had risen. Leanne smiled, gently, disarming. She asked permission to tour the settlement. Dan granted it. He escorted her himself. He showed her the same things he'd shown Victor, the tunnels, the furnaces, the smithy, but he didn't show her the salt works or the coal mine, and he didn't mention the copper vein. Leanne watched and calculated. Dan could see she was calculating, in her eyes. She was assessing production volume, number of workers, product quality, cost of infrastructure, growth potential. She was good, very good. After the tour, they sat down at Holt's house. Leanne spread out the documents. This time the proposal was different. Not an exclusive contract, a trading partnership. The Morvans would handle logistics, transporting the steel to the valley, selling it through their network, guarding the caravans. Greystone would produce, the Morvains would sell. Profits split 50-50. Dan listened. The offer was smarter than the first one, significantly smarter. The Morvains were quick learners. Or Leanne was smarter than Victor, more likely the latter. He thanked her. He asked for 3 days to think it over. Leanne nodded and settled into the guest house. 3 days. Dan thought for 2. On the 3rd day, he invited Leanne for a walk. Not to Holt's house, to the upper ledge, from where the whole village was visible. They stood side by side and looked down. Smoke from the ovens, the clang of hammers, the sound of the water wheel. People working. Dan said he was turning it down. Leanne wasn't surprised. She asked why. Dan replied, because splitting the profits while they control logistics means dependence. If the Morvains control transport and sales, they can hold up a caravan at any moment, or raise their commission, or find another supplier and drive down the price. Greystone will produce, and the Morvains will decide how much it's worth. This isn't a partnership. It's control in a pretty package. Leanne was silent. Then, for the first time in 3 days, she smiled genuinely. Not a sales smile, a real one. She said that this is exactly how she would have written this analysis if she'd been writing it for Greystone instead of the Morvains. Dan looked at her intently. She continued. She said she'd been working for the Morvains for 12 years, since she was 14. She started as an assistant. She worked her way up to a factor. For 12 years, she'd negotiated on behalf of people who made decisions without her. For 12 years, her face smiled while her mouth spoke someone else's words. She was tired. She saw that Greystone was doing the impossible. She saw how an engineer from a mountain hole was building what didn't exist in the capital, and she wanted to be a part of it. Not on behalf of the Morvains, on her own behalf. Dan was silent. Then he asked what she was proposing. Leanne replied. She was leaving the Morvains. Today. She would write a letter of resignation. She's joining Greystone as a sales agent. She knows the markets. She knows the prices. She knows the buyers. She knows which of the Valley merchants can be pitted against each other to get the best price. She's worth more than the entire House Morvain would pay for Greystone steel in a year. Dan thought for 30 seconds. Then he said one thing. Make up your mind. She raised an eyebrow. He explained. If she stayed, he would hand over all of Greystone's foreign trade to her, with signing authority, with the right to choose buyers, with the right to set prices. He wouldn't interfere unless she called on him. Leanne stood and looked at him. The wind ruffled her hair. The stove was humming downstairs. She said quietly that she needed paper and ink. Dan nodded. That evening, Leanne wrote a letter to the House of Morvain, short and polite, stating that she was leaving the service for personal reasons, thanking them for 12 years, wishing them prosperity. In the morning, she sent the letter with a passing merchant. Then she sat down at the table in the Holt house and began to work. By evening, she had a list of 14 potential buyers of Greystone steel within a 2-week journey's radius, with prices, with volumes, with terms, with notes on each one's character. Dan looked at the list and realized he had just acquired a weapon more powerful than any furnace. Leanne started small, 3 caravans in the first month. The first to the nearest mountain town, Crosstown, 200 pounds of nails and horseshoes. The second to the valley settlement of Vernhall, a shipment of steel knives and axes. The third, further south, to the trading city of Braven, steel blanks and 10 pounds of white salt as a sample. Ash personally escorted each caravan with 2 volunteers from the guard, 10 young men and women whom Ash had been running ragged every morning until they were drenched in sweat, now knew how to march in formation and hold a spear by the wrong end. Not an army, but enough to guard a 2-wagon caravan. Leanne returned from her first trip with silver and news. There were 32 silver coins, more than Greystone had ever seen at one time in its entire history. The news was more interesting. In Crosstown, the local blacksmith tried a Greystone knife and offered a standing order. 20 knives a month at 3 silver coins apiece. In Vernhall, a merchant asked about production volumes. How much steel could Greystone supply per month? Leanne gave a modest figure. The merchant nodded and placed an order for 3 months in advance. In Braven, the salt caused a sensation. White mountain salt. No sand, no impurities. The merchant tasted it and ordered 10 sacks. Leanne brought a deposit of 5 silver coins. Dan listened and counted. Trade was picking up. But along with the silver, information flowed into the settlement, and information flowed out of the settlement. Every caravan means dozens of people who see the goods and ask where they come from. Every buyer is a potential source of rumors. In 2 months, not only the mountain towns will know about Greystone, the trading houses in the valleys will know. The Crown of Velmar will know. Everyone will know. He shared his concerns with Leanne. She nodded and said that was exactly why they needed to act quickly. While the big players were hesitating, they needed to secure as many direct contracts as possible with small buyers. Build a network. When you have 20 buyers in 5 cities,
It's harder to crush you than when you have one buyer in a single city. Diversification. Dan smiled. She had used a word that didn't exist in this world. But the principle was the same as in his world. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Alongside his trading, Dan opened a gold mine. The map showed alluvial gold in a stream on the eastern slope below the village. Not vein gold, alluvial. Tiny particles washed out of the rock by water and settled in the sand at the bottom. The simplest kind of mining. A flume with riffles. Panning. The same principle as with iron ore, only on a miniature scale. He put 3 men to work panning. In the first week, they panned 4 grams. Not much. But gold is gold. 4 grams is almost a gold coin. 1 gold coin is equal to 12 silver coins. 4 grams a week is 16 a month. 2 gold coins. 24 silver coins. On top of the income from steel. But the main thing isn't the income. The main thing is that gold in this world functioned as a universal currency. Silver was accepted in the mountains and small towns. Gold was accepted everywhere. In capitals, in ports, in banks. Gold opened doors that silver couldn't even scratch. Leanne took the first 4 grams and took them to Braven. She returned with a document, a trade patent from the city of Braven, granting the settlement of Greystow. It cost 3 gold pieces. Leanne paid 2. She explained to Dan that the charter wasn't just a piece of paper. It was legal protection. With the charter, Greystone is officially recognized as a trading partner of the Free City. This means that any action by Velmar against Greystone affects Braven's interests. And Braven is a free city with its own charter and its own guard. Not a massive force, but enough to make the Crown think twice. Dan looked at the document with the seal and thought that Leanne was worth far more than 5 silver pieces a month. He raised her salary to 10 plus a share of every deal. She raised an eyebrow and said that a share was smart. Summer was passing. Greystone was growing. 120 residents, then 150, then 200. Dan barely keep up with building housing. Hammett worked 7 days a week. Mark and his crew built 1 house a week. Simple stone houses with wooden roofs and brick stoves. Every house had running water from the mains. So Yoon expanded the system. Now water flowed to 12 points instead of 4. She laid a second line from a different source in case the first one dried up. Redundancy. She loved redundancy. Dan understood. An engineer who lost a project because of someone else's decision always makes a backup copy. Ash trained the guards. 20 men. Not soldiers, militiamen, but militiamen who knew how to stand in formation and didn't run at the first shout. She drilled them from morning until noon, running up the slope in full gear. Spear work, the basics of close combat. In the evenings, she sat with Dan and drew up defense plans. Where to set up an observation post, where to string a signal rope, where to set up a roadblock on the trail to slow down horsemen. Dan listened and recalled what he knew about mountain warfare from books. Not much, but he understood the terrain, and the map showed every rock on every slope. Together they drew up a plan to defend the village. Not a fortress, an early warning and delaying system. 3 lines of observation posts along the trail, barriers, signal fires, and 1 trick that Dan suggested. He knew where there was an area of loose soil on the slope next to the trail. The map marked it in yellow. If they cut into the slope in the right spot, they could, if necessary, bring down a couple dozen tons of rock and earth onto the trail. Not to kill, to block it, to cut off the road for 2 or 3 days. That would be enough to send a messenger for help or to prepare a defense. Ash looked at him and asked how a mountain engineer knew about ambushes. Dan replied that landslides were his professional trauma, literally. So Yoon, meanwhile, was building. Not just houses. She was designing workshops. A carpentry shop for Brenna, a pottery studio for the new potter. a weaving workshop for the seamstress and her granddaughters. Each workshop stood separately, with its own water supply, and positioned to catch the wind so that smoke and dust wouldn't drift toward the residential buildings. Greystone was no longer a village. It was becoming a settlement, with streets, with a town square, with workshops and mines and guards. So Yoon sketched out a plan of the settlement, a bird's-eye view. Finn redrew it on a large sheet of birch bark with such precision that So-Yoon silently raised an eyebrow and then nodded. The boy was learning at an alarming rate. His lines had become smooth, the scales were accurate, the symbols were standard. So-Yoon had invented a system of symbols for him because there were no standard ones in this world. Finn learned them in a day and began applying them to everything: maps of tunnels, building plans, furnace diagrams. He drew constantly. One evening, he came to Dan with a sheet of birch bark. So-Yoon was drawn on it. Not a diagram, a portrait, in thin, precise lines, a profile. Her head bent over the drawing, a hand holding chalk. Dan looked at the drawing and then at Finn. The boy blushed and said it was just for fun. Dan nodded seriously and said the drawing was good. Finn took the sheet and ran off. Dan smiled. Then he stopped smiling. 6 horsemen rode into Greystone at dawn. Leading the way was a man in a dark blue cloak with a silver clasp shaped like a set of scales, the emblem of the royal treasury of Velmar. Behind him were 2 scribes with leather pouches. Behind the scribes were 3 soldiers in chainmail with short swords. The tax commission. But not Clement, a different level. Dan stood in the square by the water spigot. Holt was next to him. Leanne was slightly behind. Ash and 10 guards stood by the smithy wall. Not aggressively, just standing there, with spears. The man in the blue cloak dismounted. He was not young, about 50. A dry, stern face, intelligent eyes. He introduced himself as Raymond Dorn, Chief Inspector of the Crown Lands. He had arrived by order of the office of Lord Treasurer Velmar Setvin Orwald. Subject of the inspection? Unregistered mining operations on Crown lands. Dan felt Holt tense up beside him. The village head knew what this meant. Unregistered mining on Crown lands was not a tax violation. It was a crime against the Crown. A fine, confiscation of property, arrest of the organizer. In severe cases, hard labor. Dan remained calm. He had been preparing for this. Not for this specific day, for this scenario. He knew that sooner or later Velmar would come. The only question was when and how serious it would be. They came in earnest. Leanne stepped forward. She smiled. She introduced herself as a sales representative from the settlement of Greystone. She asked the inspector and his men to come into the guest house, to get off the road, to rest, to eat. Then they could discuss all the issues. Dorn looked at her appraisingly. He knew the type. A sales agent. A professional smile. Professional hospitality. So the settlement wasn't just a bunch of peasants with pickaxes. If they had a sales agent, that meant they had an organization. That complicated the task. Or simplified it, depending on your point of view. He accepted the invitation. They put him up. They fed him. A hot lunch of venison with sauerkraut. Fresh bread. It wasn't a show or a bribe. It was a typical Greystone meal. But for a man from the valley, hot venison and white bread in a mountain village were a surprise. Dorn noticed this and remembered it. After lunch, he demanded a tour. Dan led him personally. He showed him everything. He didn't hide anything. He didn't conceal anything. The tunnels, the furnaces, the smithy, the salt works, the coal mine, the water supply, the infirmary, the workshops, the residential buildings, the guards, everything. Jorn walked in silence.
His scribes took notes. He touched the walls of the furnaces. He looked at the water wheel. He peered into the tunnels. He asked few questions, but every question was precise. How many people work here? What is the monthly output? Where the product goes? Who buys it? At what price? Dan answered honestly. Numbers, facts, no exaggerations, no downplaying. Because Dorn wasn't a fool. They wouldn't have sent a fool. And lying to a professional inspector meant setting yourself up for failure at the very first inspection. After the inspection, they sat down in the guest house. Dorn, 2 clerks, Dan, Leanne, Holt. Dorn unfolded the documents. He read the charges. The settlement of Greystone is conducting mining operations on lands belonging to the Crown of Velmar without proper registration and without paying mining taxes. Under the Subsurface Resources Act, all production is subject to confiscation in favor of the Crown. The organizer is subject to arrest and trial. Holt turned pale. Leanne smiled. Dan sat calmly. Then he nodded to Leanne. She took out the documents. The first one. The trading license of the City of Braven. Greystone is a registered trading partner of the Free City. Any action by the Crown against Greystone affects the interests of Braven and falls under the Free Trade Clause of the Free City's Charter. Dorn read it. His expression did not change. He knew about this charter. It was a nuisance, but not insurmountable. The second document. A contract for the supply of steel products between Greystone and 3 Valley buyers, each buyer from a different jurisdiction. Confiscation of the products means breach of contract. Breach of contract means compensation. Compensation is paid by the party responsible for the breach, that is, the Crown. Dorn read it. His eyebrows rose slightly. It was well written. The third document. An application for registration of a mining operation filed with the Velmar Registry. Date of filing? 6 weeks ago. Through Braven, the official channel. With a fee of 2 gold pieces paid. Leanne pulled out the receipt. Dorn read the date. He looked at Leanne. He looked at Dan. Then at the receipt again. The application had been submitted a month before the office sent the commission. This meant that Greystone hadn't evaded registration. Greystone had submitted the application in accordance with the established procedure, and if the office hadn't had time to review it, that was the office's problem of the office, not Greystone's. Formally, the charge of unregistered mining fell apart. The application had been filed, the fee had been paid. The delay in review was on Velmar's side. Dorn sat in silence for 2 minutes. His scribes did not write. They waited. Then he spoke, calmly. No threats. He said that formally, Greystone was in the right. The application had been filed. The patent was in place. The contracts were valid. But in essence, the settlement was conducting large-scale mining on Crown lands and paying taxes as if it were a mountain village of 40 people. This is a discrepancy, and it will be rectified. Dan nodded. He had expected this. He said that Greystone was prepared to pay the mining tax in full, at the rates for mining settlements, 1/10 of the output, in silver or in kind at the Crown's discretion. Effective from the date the application was filed, retroactive. Here's a bag, 20 silver pieces, to be paid 2 months from the date of application. Leanne placed the bag on the table. Heavy, clinking. Dorn looked at the bag, then at Dan, then at the documents. He was an experienced bureaucrat. He could see that these were not illegal peasants. Before him was an organized settlement with legal training, trade connections, and silver. Confiscation was possible, but it would cost more than it was worth. A lawsuit with a free city, contractual compensation, an administrative scandal over a late application. Lord Treasurer Orwald doesn't like scandals. He likes money. 20 silver coins now, and 1/10 of the output every quarter. That's money. Clean. No scandal, no escort costs, no political fallout. Dorn made his decision. He took out a blank sheet of paper. He wrote the inspection report. Greystone Settlement. Mining operations registered. Fees paid. No violations found. Recommendation. Grant the status of a mining settlement with quarterly inspections. Signature. Seal. Leanne received a copy. Dorn took the bag. Then he stood up and asked to see a steel knife from the forge. Oswald brought the best one. Dorn tested the blade. He assessed the quality of the tempering at a glance. Then he quietly asked how many such knives the settlement could supply per month.
Leanne replied that it depended on the conditions. Dorn nodded and said that the Lord Treasurer had a personal interest in high-quality steel. Not government-funded. Personal. Leanne understood instantly. She smiled and said that special conditions were provided for the Lord Treasurer's personal orders. Special terms were provided. Dorn nodded again and left. In the morning, the commission departed, with 20 silver coins in tribute, with a single steel knife in the inspector's personal luggage, and with a document that officially granted Greystone the right to exist. Dan stood at the gate and watched the horseman ride down the road. Leanne stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said it had been an easy battle. The real one would come later, when the Lord Treasurer received the report and grasped the scale of it. When the Morvains learned that their former factor was working for Greystone. When one of Karnath's northern agents got wind of these rumors. Dan replied that he knew. Leanne continued. She said they had maybe 6 months, maybe a year. Then it won't be inspectors who come. It will be people who don't leave with 20 silver pieces. Dan turned to her. His face was calm. He said that in a year, he would build something here that 20 horsemen couldn't take, or 100, and that for that, he needed her. And So-Yun, and Ash, and Oswald, and Ty, and Gregor, and Finn, and all the 200-plus people who believed that in these mountains it was possible to live differently. Leanne was silent. Then she nodded. Once. Briefly. Then she went off to write letters. She had 14 clients and 6 new contracts that needed to be closed by the end of the month. Time was short. It was always short. Summer ended faster than Dan wanted. By early fall, Greystone had 320 residents, 4 mines, 2 smelting furnaces, a coal mine, a salt works, a gold mine, a blacksmith shop with 3 forges, a carpenter's workshop, a pottery, a weaving mill, Maya's infirmary, the guard barracks, 12 new stone houses, a water supply system serving 20 points, and a stone wall under construction around the central part of the settlement. Ash had proposed the wall. Not a high one, 1.5 meters. Enough so that a rider couldn't clear it with a running start, and so that a pedestrian would lose 3 seconds climbing over it. 3 seconds in battle is a life. Hammett was building the wall from waste rock using clay mortar. There was enough stone to build 3 walls. The waste rock from the tunnels, which used to be trash, became building material. Dan watched this and thought about closed cycles. Ore into the furnace, slag into road fill, waste rock into walls, ash from the furnaces into the garden. Nothing goes to waste. Everything works. One morning, a woman he didn't know came to him. Not young, in her 30s, tall, with a straight back and a deep, calm voice, dressed in a plain gray dress. Around her neck, a wooden medallion bearing the image of a hammer and a stone, the insignia of the Order of the Bright Stone. She introduced herself as Sister Hazel Morn, a former sister, excommunicated. Dan asked why she had been excommunicated. Hazel replied calmly, "For heresy."
She had taught at the monastery that labor is prayer, that work with one's hands is equal to work of the spirit, that a person ascends to God not on their knees, but through their deeds. The order believed otherwise. The order believed that prayer was higher than labor, and that a monk should pray, while the work should be done by the laity who fed the monastery. Hazel argued. She was warned. She continued. She was excommunicated. Dan listened, and recognized in her words something familiar. Not religious, engineering, the dignity of labor, respect for the work of one's hands, the idea that a person is defined not by who they were born as, but by what they have built. He asked why she had come to Greystone. Hazel replied that she had heard of a place where people work and their labor is visible and valued. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. Dan led her through the settlement. She walked in silence. She looked at the furnaces, at the mine shafts, at the people working, at the wall Hammett was building, at the water pipe, at the infirmary. She stopped for a long time by the infirmary. She watched Maya bandaging a miner's arm. Then she turned to Dan and asked if there was a place in the settlement for those who were dying. Dan didn't understand. Hazel explained. The mine is dangerous. People will die. If not now, then later. And when a person dies at work, his family loses more than just a breadwinner. They lose their sense of purpose. Because no one remembers. No one records it. A person lived and worked and died, and in a year his name will be forgotten. Hazel said that in the mountain monasteries they kept memorial books, names, dates, stories, to remember. Dan stood there in silence. He remembered 2 workers in Chile, the ones he'd pushed out of the tunnel, Miguel and Carlos. He remembered their names. He remembered their faces. He remembered how Miguel laughed and how Carlos showed a photo of his daughter every morning. He remembered because they were his people. And he knew that in this world, sooner or later, one of his people would die, and that someone deserved to be remembered. He asked Hazel for one thing, to keep the Greystone Memorial Book. Everyone who died on the job or in the settlement had to be recorded, with a name, with a story, with a date, in her handwriting, and once a year, a day of remembrance, for everyone. Hazel looked at him. There was something in her eyes that Dan had seen before, in Oswald's eyes when the blacksmith first heard the ringing of steel. Recognition. She said quietly that she would stay. Dan nodded. He set aside a room for her in the guest house and gave her a blank book. He had bought the book through Leanne from a merchant in Braven for 4 silver coins. Real paper. Leather binding. It was the most expensive thing Dan had bought for himself since the transfer. No, not for himself. For all of them. Hazel opened the book. The first page. She wrote the title. The Book of Greystone's Memory. Then she looked at Dan. She asked if there were any names yet. Dan thought. Then he said, Cain, the coal burner, the father of the body he lived in. Died 2 years ago, worked his whole life. No one wrote it down. Hazel nodded. She wrote down the first name. Cain, Greystone's coal burner, died alone, burned coal for 30 years, left a son. Dan stood and looked at the letters. Then he walked out. Hazel didn't follow him. She understood. By mid-fall, troubling news began to reach Greystone. Leanne brought it back from every business trip. The Morvain house learned of her departure and was furious. Not because of the loss of a factor. Because of the loss of control over Greystone steel. The Morvains began buying up steel from competitors to drive down the price. Leanne countered. She shifted sales to buyers who weren't the Morvains. Small craftsmen, village blacksmiths, city armorers working on private commissions. The network of small buyers was less profitable but more resilient. The Morvains couldn't strangle 20 small contracts as easily as one large one. The second blow came from where Dan had expected it, though he had hoped it would come later. Lord Treasurer Orwald's office sent a notice, dry and polite. The tax on mining settlements has been raised to 1/5 of production, effective immediately. Only for settlements in the mountainous region of the Bone Tooth Range. That is, only for Greystone. An individual rule disguised as a general regulation. Dan read the notice and passed it to Leanne. She read it, smiled, said that Orwald was clever. 1/5 is painful, but not fatal. He's pushing, testing the limits. If Greystone pays without objection, in 6 months it'll be 1/4, then 1/3, then confiscation. We need to resist, but not with outright refusal. Dan asked how. Leanne explained. An appeal through the Braven Commercial Court. A formal procedure. A long one. 6 months minimum. While the case is pending, payments are made at the old rate, 1/10. Orwald can't raise the rate until the court issues a ruling, and in 6 months, Greystone will have grown so much that confiscation will become politically impossible. Dan agreed. Leanne filed the appeal that same day. A letter with a seal and 2 gold coins in postage was sent via a merchant in Braven. The third blow was physical. At night, 3 days after the tax notice. Dan woke to a scream. Ash stood at his door with a torch in her hand. She spoke briefly. Fire. The small smelter. Dan ran out. The first furnace, the very smallest one, made of goat skins, the one where it all began. It wasn't burning. The shed above it was burning. Wooden, dry. The flames rose 3 meters high. Sparks were flying toward the finished goods warehouse. Dan was shouting orders. Bren and Mark were hauling water from the hydrant. Ty was dousing the base of the fire with dirt. Finn was carrying tools out from under the canopy. Ash stood by the gate and monitored the perimeter. Her guards were at their posts. She didn't put out the fire. She kept watch. Because the fire could have been a diversion. 20 minutes later, the fire was extinguished. The shed burned down. The furnace survived. The warehouse was unharmed. The losses were minimal. In the morning, Ash came to Dan with a find, a rag soaked in oil, at the base of the shed. Arson, not an accident. Someone had come in the night, set it on fire, and left. Ash said the tracks led down the trail toward the highway. One person, light on their feet, fast, a professional, not a bandit. A bandit would have set fire to the warehouse, not an empty shed. This one wanted to scare them, to send a message. Dan stood over the remains of the shed and thought. The Morvains, or Orwald, or a third party he didn't know about yet. He looked at So-Yoon, who was inspecting the furnace for damage. She looked up and their eyes met. She said the furnace was intact. Dan nodded. Then he said aloud what he'd been thinking all these months. They needed a second line for everything. A second smelter, a second warehouse, a second route to the highway. Redundancy. If someone destroyed one point, production would stop for a day, not a month. So-Yoon nodded. She was already drawing up plans. Dan was building in a safety margin. Every day, every hour. The third smelting furnace was built on the southern slope, away from the first 2. So-Yoon designed it as a self-contained unit, its own ore warehouse, its own coal supply, its own water wheel on a separate stream. If someone destroyed the main site, the third furnace would keep running, and vice versa. The redundancy that So-Yoon loved had turned from a principle into a survival strategy. The population was growing, 400 people by mid-autumn, then 450. It wasn't just the poor who came. Craftsmen from small towns were arriving, a mason from Crosstown, a tanner from Vernhall, 2 carpenter brothers who built mills, a young literate man from a bankrupt trading house who knew to keep the books. Dan put him to work with Leanne. She breathed a sigh of relief. She said she could finally focus on strategy instead of entries in a notebook. Ash was building up the guard. 30 men, not militiamen, semi-professionals. She selected them rigorously, not by strength, by wits. She needed people who didn't panic, who followed orders, who thought 3 steps ahead.
Among the newcomers, she found a former army sergeant named Velmar, discharged due to a wound, missing a leg below the knee. He walked on a wooden prosthesis. But he knew drill and small unit tactics better than any textbook. Ash made him her assistant. He trained the guards while she handled reconnaissance and planning. Dan did something for Ash that she hadn't asked for. He designed armor, not full knight's armor, a light steel breastplate, tailored to her specific build, to her fighting style. He'd watched her train for 2 weeks, saw how she moved, left-handed, turns to the left when attacking, takes blows with her right shoulder, jumps backward instead of dodging to the side. He sketched the breastplate with markings. There's a hinge here because you twist to the left and need freedom at the waist. There's reinforcement here because you expose your right shoulder. The cutout is deeper here because you press your left elbow against your side during a thrusting strike. Oswald spent 3 days forging it according to the blueprint. Fittings, adjustments, alterations. Dan stood nearby and made corrections. No, it's too tight here. It sags here. The strap here needs to be a finger's width longer. When the breastplate was ready, Ash put it on. She fastened the straps. She moved around. She spun. She punched the air. Then she froze. She stood there and looked at herself, at the steel that lay on her like a second skin, at the hinge that moved exactly where it needed to, at the reinforcement that covered exactly the spot she was exposing. Someone was watching her. Not the fighter. Her. Ash. Saw her fight. Remembered. And made something that said, "I see you." She stood there for a long time. Then she took off the chest plate. Set it down carefully. She turned to Dan. Opened her mouth to say something. Didn't say it. Nodded. Walked away. That evening, Finn told him he'd seen Ash by the stream. She was sitting on a rock, holding the chest plate on her lap, and running her fingers over the hinge. For a long time. Dan said nothing. At the start of the second winter, news arrived in Greystone that changed everything. Leanne returned from Braven with an expression on her face that Dan had never seen before. She was agitated. Leanne was never agitated. She sat down at the table and told them. The Artifact Guild, the most powerful organization on the continent. Monopolists of magic crystals. They know about Greystone. Not about the steel. About the mountains. The main crystal deposit in the east of the continent has been depleted. Prices have tripled in a year. The guild is frantically searching for new sources. And someone told them that there are signs of magical activity in the Bone Tooth Range. Leanne didn't know who had told them. Maybe a merchant. Maybe an Orwald spy had sold the information. Maybe one of Greystone's new residents had let it slip. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the guild knew, and the guild would come. Dan sat in silence. He was thinking about the blue dots at the very bottom of the map, at a depth of 1.5 kilometers. Crystals. Magical ones. The very ones the map had shown him from day one. He hadn't touched them. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. 1.5 kilometers vertically was beyond anything he could build in 10 lifetimes with his current resources. But the guild doesn't know the depth. The guild only knows that the crystals are somewhere here, and the guild is used to getting what it wants. He asked Leanne how much time they had. She replied that the guild works slowly. Bureaucracy. Approvals. Maybe 3 months until the first visit. Maybe 4. Dan nodded. 4 months.
In 4 months, he had to make greystones so valuable and so well protected that neither the guild, nor Orwald, nor the Morvanes, nor anyone else could just come and take it. Not with walls. Walls can be broken. Through connections, contracts, dependencies, making it so that too many people in too many cities depended on Greystone's steel and salt and coal, so that the destruction of Greystone would hit the pockets of dozens of influential people. It wasn't a defense of walls. It was a defense of the economy. He gathered everyone, So-Yun, Leanne, Ash, Holt, Tai, Oswald. He told them, not everything, not about the crystals, about the fact that the big players had taken notice and would be coming soon. We need to prepare. Leanne got to work that very hour. Over the next month, she signed contracts with 26 buyers in 7 cities. Steel, salt, coal, nails, horseshoes, knives, axes. Every contract required prepayment. Every prepayment was a buyer's commitment. Every commitment was a thread tying someone's interest to Greystone's existence. So-Yun built the 4th furnace, an expansion of the salt works, a second water line, stone warehouses for finished goods. The road to the highway was widened and reinforced for heavy wagons. Ash strengthened the defenses. The wall closed in around the central section. Watchposts were already stationed on 2 roads. 30 guards were on duty in shifts. Dan worked 20 hours a day. Tunnels, furnaces, blueprints, calculations, negotiations. He was losing weight and didn't notice. Maya noticed. She came to him in the evening when he was sitting by the fire and sketching on a stone. She sat down next to him. She didn't say a word. She just set a bowl of hot broth and a piece of bread in front of him. Dan looked at the food, then at her. She said that if he died of exhaustion, she'd have to treat the whole village for panic, and that was worse than miner's cough. Dan laughed. For the first time in 2 weeks. He ate the broth. He ate the bread. Maya sat nearby and said nothing. Then she said it was cold in the infirmary at night. The stove burned out by midnight, and there was no one to stoke it. She slept in the infirmary when there was a seriously ill patient. And there were seriously ill patients, almost all the time. Dan got up and went to the infirmary. He inspected the stove. The problem was simple. The firebox was small. It burned out quickly. He needed a stove with a large firebox and slow burning capacity. He knew of such a design. A Dutch stove, tall and narrow, with a long chimney and a system of channels that trap hot air inside. It burns all night on a single load. He built it in 3 days. Himself. He didn't put Hammett in charge. Winter came, and Greystone met it differently than a year ago. Not as a village trying to survive, as a settlement ready for a siege. There was enough coal for 3 winters, salted meat for a year. They bought grain in bulk through Leanne from Braven at fall prices. Every house was heated with coal. Every tap ran with water. The infirmary operated around the clock. The guards were on duty. And in every house hung a steel knife made in Oswald's forge. Over 500 people. Dan repeated that number to himself. A year ago, 40. Now, 500. He knew every one of the first 100. He knew the rest by their work teams and their jobs. Tai managed 4 tunnels and 30 miners. Bren oversaw construction. So-Yun designed everything that required calculations. Leanne handled trade. Ash provided security. Maya treated the sick. Hazel took notes. Holt settled disputes. Finn drew plans. The machine worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. At the beginning of winter, Dan did what he'd been thinking about for a long time. He opened a school. Not a building, a process.
Every evening, children and teenagers gathered in the large hall by the forge. 16 people. Finn taught them to draw. So-yoon taught them math. Hazel taught them to read and write. 3 teachers, 3 subjects, 6 evenings a week. Dan was there when he could. He talked about rock types, about metals, about how a mountain is built from the inside. The children listened with their mouths agape. To them, a man who could see through stone was something of a fairy tale hero. Dan tried not to feed that illusion. He said he didn't see through stone, but by stone, by its color, by its sound, by its weight. It was the same half-truth he told everyone, and with every passing month, it weighed on him more and more. Because these people trusted him, and he couldn't tell them the truth, not about the map, about himself, about the fact that he wasn't the coal burner's son, that he was a stranger in a foreign body, that his knowledge came from a world that doesn't exist here. One night he told So-yoon, not everything, not about the map, but about the fact that he knows more than he should, that his knowledge doesn't come from books you can find at the academy, that he wasn't who they thought he was. So-yoon listened in silence. They were sitting by the 3rd furnace, the night shift, quiet, only the sound of water on the wheel and the hum of the bellows. When he fell silent, she stared into the fire for a long time. Then she said she didn't care. Dan blinked. So-yoon explained. She said it didn't matter to her where he got his knowledge from. What mattered was what he did. He built a settlement. He gave people jobs. He gave her a job, a real one, for the first time in her life. No matter where his knowledge came from, it worked. It saved lives. It made steel. It provided warmth in winter. Everything else was his own business, and she wasn't going to interrogate him. Then she paused, and added that if he did decide to tell her more, she'd listen. But not now. Right now, their 3rd furnace was producing 8% less than expected, and that worried her more than his secrets. Dan looked at her. Then he laughed. So-yoon snorted. They sat down to calculate the losses on the 3rd furnace. An hour later, they found the problem. Air was seeping in through a crack in the bottom row of the brickwork. So-yoon patched it up. The output returned to the expected level. The first accident happened in the winter. A cave-in the 4th tunnel, a small one. 3 meters of the roof had collapsed. 2 miners were trapped under the rubble, one of the new guys, his name was Rolf. And Bren. Gregor raised the alarm. His hoarse cry reached the yard, and within a minute, 20 people were standing by the tunnel. Dan was the first to arrive. The map showed the collapse. 2 men under the rock, alive. An air pocket. A meter of open space between the fallen boulders. Enough air for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. He organized the rescue. By hand. Carefully, they removed each rock one by one. Securing the space behind them, Gregor stood behind them and gave orders. Put the support here, the top beam, the prop. Take your time. Rock by rock. 40 minutes later, they had broken through. Rolf sat in the darkness. Bren lay beside him. Rolf was unharmed, scared but unharmed. Bren had been hit in the leg by a rock, a broken shin, open fracture. The bone was sticking out through the skin. They carried him out on a stretcher. Maya was already at the tunnel entrance. She looked at the leg, and her face turned to stone. The fracture was bad. In this world, that meant one thing: amputation, or a slow death from infection. Maya told Dan this, quietly, away from the others. Dan looked at Bren, the guy who built the water wheel, who carved the blades until his hands were calloused, who learned carpentry from scratch and now led the construction crew. The guy who was 23 years old. Dan told Maya, no.
No amputation. Set it. Immobilize it. Clean the wound. He described the procedure. Splinting. Wooden splints. Copper staples for fixation. Rinsing the wound with boiled salt water. Bandages made of clean cloth. Change them twice a day. Monitor body temperature. If a fever rises, use willow bark. Natural aspirin. Maya listened. Her eyes darted between Dan and Brenna. She said she had never set an open fracture. Dan replied that neither had he, but he had seen it done, and he described it, in detail, step by step. Maya inhaled, exhaled. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to Bren. Dan stood nearby and spoke, quietly, steadily, every step. The bone was set, splints were applied, clamps were tightened, the wound was cleaned. Bren screamed once. The spring of the second year brought guests whom Dan had been waiting for and whom he feared. The first to arrive were the people of the Artifact Guild. Not an army, a delegation. 3 of them. An elderly mage in a gray robe with a gold chain across his chest, a young assistant with a leather briefcase, and a guard. Just one. The guild wasn't afraid of mountain villages. It feared only its competitors. The mage's name was Turvin Gross. He was polite, well-educated. He spoke softly. He drank tea with Holt and praised the salt. Then he asked permission to explore the mountain slopes. He was interested in minerals, any kind, for academic purposes. Dan gave his permission. He accompanied him personally. Turvin Gross walked along the slopes and did something Dan recognized instantly. He was scanning. The mage had his own way of sensing the rock. He touched the stones and froze for a few seconds. His eyes glazed over. He was listening to the mountain. Dan watched and understood. The guild had its own methods of reconnaissance, not as precise as his map, but sufficient to detect magical activity at depth. And Turvin had detected it. Dan could see it in his face. When the mage touched the rock face on the eastern slope and froze for a full minute, when he opened his eyes, there was excitement in them that he tried to hide but couldn't. He said calmly that the rock was interesting. He asked if Dan had noticed any unusual glow or heat in the deep tunnels. Dan replied that he hadn't. That was true. The tunnels were shallow. It was 1.5 miles to the crystals. There was no glow at that depth. Turvin nodded. Then, over dinner at the guest house, he got down to business. The Artifact Guild wants to conduct deep exploration in the Bone Tooth Range. Drilling. Tunneling. Using magical methods. A base is needed for this. Greystone is ideally located. The guild is offering a partnership. It will finance the exploration. Greystone provides the base and the workforce. If crystals are found, the guild receives exclusive mining rights. Greystone receives 10% of the value of the crystals, plus payment for the workers' labor. 10%. Dan sat and did the math. 10% of crystals that are worth more than gold. That would be a huge fortune for Greystone. But exclusive mining rights meant that the guild would control the most valuable resource beneath its mountains. And whoever controls the resource controls the territory. In a year, Greystone would become a service settlement for the guild's mine. Not a city, not an independent settlement, a work camp. Dan thanked Turvin. He said the offer was serious and required discussion. He asked for a week. Turvin agreed and left. He promised to return with the final documents. When his horse disappeared around the bend, Dan called a meeting. So-Yun, Leanne, Ash, Holt, Ty, Oswald, Hazel. He told them everything he knew. Not about the map, about the crystals, about the fact that they're supposedly deep within the mountain range, about the fact that the guild senses them, about the offer, about the fact that 10% is a trap. Leanne spoke first. She knew the guild, 12 years at a trading house that worked with them. The guild isn't a partner. The guild is a monopoly. They don't share. They devour.
10% will become 5 in a year. In 2 years, 0. And the contract will be written so that the only way out is through complete bankruptcy. Ash said that if the guild gets the mining rights, it will bring in its own people, its own security, its own rules, and the Greystone Guard will become a mere prop. So-yoon was silent. Then she said there was another option, not to grant the guild access, but not to refuse outright either, because a direct refusal to the guild would be a declaration of war against an organization with more money and influence than all of Southern Velmar combined. Instead, drag it out, legally, economically, politically. Dan nodded. That was what he had in mind, and Leanne already knew how. 2 days later, she sent 3 letters. The first to Braven, to the Trade Council, with a proposal to expand the trading charter. Greystone requested the status of a free fishing town under Braven's protection. Not full independence, autonomy. The right to independently manage its natural resources. In exchange, Greystone guaranteed Braven preferential prices for steel and salt for the next 10 years. The second letter went to the valley town of Marenhall, a major buyer of steel. Leanne proposed a joint venture for coal mining. Greystone Mines. Marenhall would purchase exclusively at a fixed price below market value. In return, Marenhall would formally include the Greystone coal mines in its registry of industrial assets. This provided a legal link. The confiscation of the Greystone mines would now affect Marenhall's assets. The third letter went directly to Orwald. Leanne proposed a compromise on the tax. Greystone pays a higher rate, a fifth. No trial, no appeal. In exchange, Orwald signs a patent for mining autonomy, which legally prohibits anyone other than Greystone from mining on the territory of the Bonetooth Range, including the Artifact Guild. It was a masterstroke. Orwald hated the guild. All the treasurers hated the guild because the guild didn't pay taxes. If Orwald signed the patent, the guild wouldn't be able to enter the range without the consent of both the Crown and Greystone, and Orwald would get his increased tax revenue and the satisfaction of having shown the guild the door. Dan looked at Leanne as she explained the scheme. Then he said she was a genius. Leanne raised an eyebrow and replied that she wasn't a genius. She was a courier, with 12 years of experience working for herself for the first time. Those were different things. The replies came within a month. Braven agreed to the expanded patent. The preferential steel prices were too good to pass up. Marenhall signed the joint venture. Cheap coal solved their energy problems for years to come. Orwald took longer to decide. 2 weeks. Then he sent a reply. Polite, dry. A 1/5 stake was accepted. The patent for operational autonomy was signed, with one caveat: an annual inspection with the right to review the terms. Dan read it. The stipulation was standard and harmless. An annual inspection meant Dorn would come, get his cut, and leave. A review of the terms was possible only in the event of a breach. And Greystone doesn't violate. Greystone pays. On time. In full. When Terwin Gross returned a month later with the documents, Leanne met him with a smile and 3 patents: commercial, industrial. A year had passed, the second year since that morning when Dan woke up on the dirt floor of a shack with a goat behind the wall. Greystone had a population of 972, and 1 cat that Finn had brought to the smithy that winter, and whom everyone called Slag. Dan was sitting in his study, not a shack, a 2-room stone house near the square. The walls were covered with blueprints, the desk was piled high with papers. On the shelf stood the first ingot they had smelted from a small furnace fueled by goat pelts. He kept it the way others keep metals, because it wasn't just an ingot, it was proof that it all began. In the morning, Leanne came in with a report. Greystone's trade turnover for the last quarter was 412 gold. Steel went to 11 cities, salt to 8, coal to 4. Gold from the mine yielded a steady 6 gold pieces a month. Greystone paid its taxes to Velmar on time and in full. Orwald received his 5th and was satisfied.
Not because he loved Greystone, but because he loved money.
And the money was flowing. Leanne placed the report on the table and said she had news. Sethvin Orwald had sent a personal letter, not through the office, via a personal courier. The Lord Treasurer of Velmar invites Greystone's director, Daniel Kane, to an official meeting in the capital to discuss expanded cooperation. Dan read the letter. Polite, dry, every word weighed. Orwald wanted to meet in person, to look into the eyes of the man who, in 2 years, had turned a destitute village into an industrial center, to understand who he was and what to do with him. Dan put the letter on the table and told Leanne he would go. She nodded. She said she would go with him. Dan didn't argue. Before leaving, he walked through all of Greystone, not for an inspection, for himself. The iron tunnel was running 3 shifts. Ty stood at the entrance talking to the night shift foreman. He saw Dan. He nodded. That nod was worth more than words. Ty, who 2 years ago had sat on the doorstep empty-handed, sharpening a useless pickaxe, now managed 30 miners and 4 tunnels. He knew every meter of every tunnel. He knew every man by name. Dan walked on. The coal mine. Bren was limping at the entrance, cursing at a young delivery man who had parked his wheelbarrow in the wrong spot. His leg had healed crookedly, but he was working. He led a construction crew that now numbered 20 men. They built quickly, solidly, according to So-Yun's blueprints and Finn's plans. Dan walked on. The forge. 3 furnaces. 6 apprentices. Oswald stood by the main furnace and taught a young man how to harden steel. His hands moved with confidence. His voice was calm. He no longer cursed at the metal. The metal obeyed, because Oswald knew it now. Not like a village blacksmith who strikes and hopes, like a master who understands. Dan walked on. So-Yun's workshop, a separate building with a large table and windows on 3 sides, walls covered in drawings. Finn sat at the second table and was drawing. Not a tunnel plan, a map. A map of all of Greystone, a bird's-eye view, with every house, with every tunnel, with every path, with the symbols he and So-Yun had developed together. Cha-Hee-Ra, the girl cartographer who had come to Greystone in the fall, sat next to Finn and was redrawing a section of the map onto a blank sheet of paper. She had come from a neighboring village beyond the pass. An orphan, 17 years old. She drew everything she saw. Faces, mountains, diagrams, from memory, at first glance. Dan gave her tools on the very first day. Chalk, a compass, a set square, a board. He told her to draw properly. She cried then, silently, turning away. Now she wasn't crying. She was working, next to Finn, who blushed when she arrived and had been blushing ever since whenever their hands accidentally touched over the drawing. So-Yun pretended not to notice. Dan pretended not to notice. Everyone pretended. Dan walked on. The infirmary. Maya stood at the table mixing ointment. Her movements were precise and quick. She now had assistants, 2 girls from the newcomers whom she was training. 1 man lay in the ward, old Egmar, the very same one who had been coughing 2 years ago when Dan first opened the door to the shack. Egmar wasn't dying, he was just old, and Maya was looking after him. Hot water from the taps, clean bandages, warmth. The old man lay there and smiled. Dan peeked in. Egmar saw him and said hoarsely that earlier in the winter his bones had ached so much he couldn't get up. But now it was warm and they didn't hurt. And that he'd heard Dan building something new every day, and that it was a good sound, the sound of the future. Dan stood in the doorway and said nothing. Then he nodded and left. He walked through the streets of Greystone and looked. At the stone houses with iron hinges, at the water pipes,
at the wall that surrounded the central part, at the ash guards in steel helmets, at the children running down the street with wooden swords, at the women washing clothes at the tap and laughing, at the old men sitting on benches and looking at the mountains. A year ago, there were 40 starving people here. Now there were nearly 1,000, with work, with silver, with warmth, with a future. He walked past Hazel's house. She was sitting by the window, writing in a book, the Greystone Memorial Book. In 2 years, there had been 4 names in it. Cain the coal burner, old woman Igra, who had died in her sleep last winter, a man named Cole, who fell from the scaffolding in the summer, and a child, a 3-month-old girl. Fever. Maya couldn't save her. 4 names in 2 years. In a world where mountain villages lost 10 people over the winter, that was an achievement.
But Hazel wrote each name as if she were writing it with her own blood. Slowly, carefully, with a story. Dan stopped at the gate. He looked at the mountains. The map glowed softly. Red iron, black coal, white salt, gold, copper, and deep within, the blue dots of crystals. They shimmered as always, distant, inaccessible. But now he saw something else. At the very edge of the map's visibility, where the blue dots faded into impenetrable depths, straight lines, straight, geometrically precise, tunnels that no one had ever dug. They had been there from the very beginning, but now he saw them more clearly. Either the map was becoming more vivid with use, or he had learned to look deeper, or something down below was awakening. The tunnels stretched for kilometers, regular, symmetrical. This wasn't nature. Nature doesn't make right angles. This was architecture. Someone had built this, long ago, a very long time ago. And Dan's map wasn't a gift. It was a key, a diagnostic interface, left behind by those who built it, for those who would come after. He stood and looked into the depths of the ridge, and the ridge looked back at him. In the evening, he climbed up to the upper ledge, alone. He sat down on a rock. He looked down at Greystone, the lights of the furnaces, smoke, the warm glow of the windows, the guards' torches, someone's pipe. Footsteps behind him. So Yun climbed up after him. She sat down beside him. Silently, she held out a mug of hot cider. Dan took it, took a sip. They sat in silence. A year ago, there had been 40 hungry people here. So Yun asked, "And now?" Dan counted in his head. 972. And 1 cat that Finn had brought to the smithy. So Yun snorted. They were silent. The wind blew the smoke from the furnaces eastward. The stars began to appear one by one. Somewhere below, Ash was making her rounds, and her voice drifted up in fragments of commands. A light was on in the infirmary. Maya was working late, as always. In the workshop, Finn was drawing by candlelight. He'd been told 100 times that it was bad for his eyes. He'd nodded 100 times and kept going. In the smithy, Oswald was polishing the anvil. Every evening, a ritual. In the guest house, Hazel was reading her book. She wasn't writing, she was reading. 4 names. She reread them every evening. To remember. In the square, Holt sat on a bench and looked at the water spigot. He did this often.
He just sat and watched the water flow. 30 years without water. Now there was water. He watched and couldn't get used to it. Leanne sat at the table in the house by the square and wrote letters by the light of 3 candles. 14 buyers had turned into 26, 26 into 41. The web was growing. Every thread made Greystone a little stronger, a little more resilient, a little freer. Gregor sat at the entrance to the iron tunnel, on his bucket, just like 2 years ago. His back still ached. He still couldn't stand for more than an hour, but he sat by the tunnel and listened. He tapped on the support, checked the sound, and he taught the young ones. 2 of his apprentices now set the supports better than most of the valley miners. Dan set his mug down on a rock. So-yoon looked at him. He spoke softly. So-yoon. She waited. He said, "There's something under that ridge. Not ore, not coal. Something else. Something old. I see tunnels that no one dug. They go kilometers deep, neat, straight, like the corridors of a building." So-yoon was silent. Then she asked, in an even voice, how long he'd been seeing this. Dan replied that it had been since day 1, but now it's clearer. So-yoon looked at the mountains, then at him, then back at the mountains. She said that explained a lot. His knowledge of the rock, his precision in drilling, the way he finds veins that no one else can find. Dan nodded. So-yoon was silent for a moment. Then she asked what he planned to do about it. Dan replied that nothing for now. Greystone isn't ready yet. People aren't ready yet. He isn't ready yet. But someday, when the city is strong enough, when they have enough people and resources and knowledge, then they'll start digging deeper and find out what's down there. So-yoon nodded. Then she said that when he was ready, she would design the mine, no matter how deep it was. Dan looked at her. She was looking at the mountains. Her face was calm and confident, the face of an engineer who knows her job. He smiled. He said thank you. She snorted and replied that he could thank her once the mine was up and running. They sat on a rock. The mugs were growing cold. Greystone glowed with lights below. Somewhere deep within the ridge, blue dots of crystals flickered, and beyond them, tunnels that no one had ever dug stretched into the darkness. Night was falling. Quiet, cold, starry. Dan looked at his city, at the people sleeping in warm homes, at the furnaces humming in the night, at the wall that kept the peace, and at the mountains that kept the secret. He said quietly, "It seems we've only just begun." So-yoon didn't answer. She just sat beside him. That was enough. Night fell on Greystone, on its mines and furnaces, on its walls and houses, on its people and their hopes, on the mountains that had stood for millennia and would stand for just as long, and on the tunnels deep below that waited, patiently, as they always had. Greystone slept. Its director sat on a rock above the city and gazed into the darkness. He had come here empty-handed, in a foreign body, with the memories of a dead engineer. He found the ore, smelted iron, made steel, built furnaces and tunnels and walls, gathered people, gave them work and silver and warmth and a future, protected them from those who wanted to take it all away. And he knew there would be more ahead, more work, more people, more dangers. Orwald's in the capital, the guild on the horizon, northern Karnat, of which he had heard only whispers, and the tunnels deep underground that drew him in like a magnet. But all that was tomorrow. Tonight. Tonight, the stars. Tonight, the warm light in the windows of the houses he had built for the people who trusted him. Dan finished his now cold cider. He set the mug down on a rock. He stood up. He reached out his hand to So-Yun. She took his hand and stood up. They walked down to Greystone, in silence, along the path he had worn down over 2 years of walking from the ledge to the settlement and back. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new smelting run, a new blueprint, a new letter, a new problem and a new solution. But for now, it was night. Quiet. Peaceful. The first night in a long time that Daniel Kane went to bed not with a blueprint in his hand, but with the feeling that everything was in its place, that the town was alive, that the people were safe, that the bray are burning, that the salt is white, that the steel rings, that the water flows, that Gregor is sitting on a bucket, that Finn is drawing, that Maya is healing, that Ash is keeping watch, that Oswald is forging, that Hazel is remembering, that Leanne is counting, that Holt is looking at the water, and that So-Yun will come tomorrow morning and say that the third furnace is again producing 3% less than expected and that it's driving her crazy. And he'll smile, and they'll go fix the furnace. Together.